Hey guys, tonight we begin with a river. One so deceptively calm, so reliably predictable, and so absolutely essential that an entire civilization decided to gamble their existence on an annual flood schedule. The Nile wasn't just a water source, it was a deity, a calendar, a transportation network, and a waste disposal system all rolled into one convenient geological feature, which is ancient Egyptian for, we put all our eggs in one very long basket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you want to understand why you wouldn't survive in ancient Egypt, you can't start with pyramids or pharaohs or hieroglyphics on every available surface. No. You start with the most fundamental question any living organism has ever asked. Where is the water, and is it trying to kill me? Because ancient Egypt, for all its architectural ambition and bureaucratic sophistication, was essentially a very thin green strip of maybe you won't die immediately, sandwiched between two massive expanses of definitely die immediately. The Nile Valley was life. Everything beyond the Nile Valley was the Western Desert on one side, which is Egyptian for good luck with that, and the Eastern Desert on the other side, which is Egyptian for, no, seriously, good luck with that. The entire habitable zone of Egypt was maybe 15 miles wide at its most generous, which means every single person, animal, crop, temple, palace, and grandiose monument to eternal memory was crammed into a corridor that would fit comfortably inside modern New Jersey. Except New Jersey has rest stops and questionable diners. Ancient Egypt had the Nile and optimism. The river did what the river always did. It flooded. Every single year, like clockwork, between July and October, the Nile would swell with runoff from Ethiopian highlands and Central African lakes and transform the entire valley into a temporary lake. Not a gentle, romantic lake. A massive, muddy, silt-carrying lake that would redefine property boundaries and occasionally sweep away anything insufficiently tied down. But here's the thing. Ancient Egyptians loved this flood. They worshipped this flood. They built their entire calendar around this flood, because when the water receded, it left behind a layer of rich, black, mineral-packed silt that turned otherwise mediocre soil into agricultural gold. Call it divine fertilization. If the flood was too low, crops failed. People starved. Pharaohs lost credibility. If the flood was too high, villages drowned. Crops failed differently. People starved differently. Pharaohs lost credibility differently. The acceptable range between not enough water and way too much water was maybe 2 or 3 feet, which is ancient Egyptian for we built an entire civilization on a geological margin of error. Meanwhile, modern agriculture has irrigation systems, weather forecasting, crop insurance, and the ability to complain about rainfall on social media. Ancient Egypt had nilometers, which were essentially fancy measuring sticks, and prayers, lots of prayers, to multiple gods. Because apparently when your survival depends on annual flooding patterns, you don't take chances with monotheism. The Nile wasn't just essential for agriculture, it was essential for everything. Transportation, the Nile, trade, the Nile, waste disposal, also the Nile, which meant you were drinking, bathing in and farming with the same water source everyone upstream was using as a sewer. Truly precious. Adorable. Ancient Egyptians did have some awareness of water quality. They knew stagnant water was dangerous. They knew certain water sources made people sick. But their solution wasn't sophisticated filtration or treatment systems. Their solution was, let's just use the Nile and hope the current dilutes whatever unpleasant substances are floating around. And there were many unpleasant substances floating around. The Nile was home to crocodiles, which are essentially prehistoric murder logs with teeth. Hippos, which are essentially 3-ton rage monsters with surprisingly good sprint speed. And parasites. So many parasites. Schistosomiasis, which is medical Latin for tiny worms that swim through your skin, enter your bloodstream, and make your life significantly less pleasant, was endemic throughout ancient Egypt. The life cycle of schistosomiasis reads like a horror story written by someone who really understood biological warfare. Infected humans shed parasite eggs through urine or feces. Those eggs reach water. They hatch into microscopic swimming larvae. The larvae infect snails, which serve as unwitting parasite condominiums. The parasites develop inside the snails, then get released back into the water as different, more advanced larvae that can penetrate human skin. Those larvae enter your body, mature into adult worms, travel through your bloodstream, settle in your intestines or bladder, and start laying eggs, which you shed back into the water, completing the cycle. It's elegant, really, if elegance can be defined as nightmare fuel with impressive biological complexity. Ancient Egyptians called it air, which doesn't sound particularly threatening until you realise it caused chronic pain, bloody urine, organ damage, and eventual death. Archaeological evidence suggests up to 70% of the population was infected at some point, which means walking into the Nile wasn't recreation, it was Russian roulette with parasites. But you had to use the Nile. There was no alternative. The desert wasn't an option. The desert was death with sand. The Nile was life with parasites. Ancient Egyptians chose life with parasites, which is Egyptian for we make do. Let's talk about food, because apparently surviving ancient Egypt required constant caloric intake, and the menu was limited. The agricultural foundation of Egypt was emmer wheat and barley. That's it. Those were the staple crops. Everything else was supplementary, which meant your diet was primarily bread and beer, not artisanal sourdough and craft IPA. Ancient Egyptian bread, which was coarse, gritty, and full of sand particles from the grinding process, and ancient Egyptian beer, which was thick, nutritious, and barely alcoholic. The bread was so abrasive it wore down people's teeth at an alarming rate. Dental attrition was universal among ancient Egyptians. By age 40, if you lived that long, which was statistically unlikely, your teeth were ground down to nubs. Dental abscesses were common. Jaw infections were common. Death from dental complications was surprisingly common, which is ancient Egyptian for bread was actively trying to kill you. The beer was slightly less homicidal. It was made from partially baked bread crumbled into water, left to ferment, and consumed while still thick and yeasty. It wasn't meant to get you drunk. It was meant to provide calories, hydration, and B vitamins. Workers received beer as payment. Children drank beer. Everyone drank beer, because water was questionable and beer was at least fermented. The daily ration for an adult labourer was about 2 litres of beer and 20 loaves of bread, which sounds generous until you realise those loaves were small, dense, and functionally equivalent to edible bricks. And that was if you were lucky enough to be working on a major state project with guaranteed rations. If you were an independent farmer, your food security depended entirely on your harvest, which depended entirely on the flood, which depended entirely on factors completely beyond your control. Meat was rare. Poultry was occasional. Fish was common but considered spiritually questionable by some priests, who abstained from fish because apparently the Nile perch had some complicated theological baggage involving Osiris and severed body parts, which is ancient Egyptian for we made our food regulations unnecessarily complicated. Vegetables existed. Onions, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, leeks. But vegetables didn't provide the caloric density required for manual labour in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You needed bread. You needed beer. You needed those specific staples, which required successful wheat and barley harvests, which required precise flood levels, which required divine favour or geographical luck. The entire food system was one bad flood season away from famine, and famines happened, regularly. The historical record is full of famines. The famine stealer, which was probably propaganda but still reflected genuine fears, described a 7-year famine during the Third Dynasty, where the Nile didn't flood properly and people ate whatever they could find, which wasn't much. During famines, social order deteriorated rapidly. People sold themselves into slavery for food. Parents sold their children for food. Tomb robbery increased because desperate people don't particularly care about disturbing eternal rest if it means accessing burial goods they can trade for grain. The government tried to maintain grain reserves, but storage technology was primitive and rodents were enthusiastic. Storing grain for 7 years in ancient Egypt was like storing cash in a house full of mice who could pick locks. Let's talk about work, because apparently not dying in ancient Egypt required labour, and the labour was biblical. Literally biblical. The biblical plagues, the enslavement narratives, the massive construction projects. Those stories have complicated historical accuracy, but the general vibe was correct. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built on human muscle power, and that muscle power was extracted through systems that modern people would call exploitative, and ancient Egyptians called Tuesday. If you were a farmer, which most people were, your life followed the flood cycle. Akhet was the inundation season, when the Nile flooded and you couldn't farm because your fields were underwater. Pere was the growing season, when the water receded and you could plant and tend crops. Shemu was the harvest season, when you collected everything before the next flood arrived. During Akhet, when you couldn't farm, you were conscripted for state labour projects, building temples, building tombs, building monuments, building pyramids, which were essentially vanity projects for dead pharaohs who wanted to be remembered forever, and decided the best way to achieve immortality was making thousands of people move millions of stones. The labour wasn't volunteer, it was corvée labour, which is French for the government owns your time and you don't get to negotiate. You showed up, you worked, you received rations, you went home if you survived. The rations were adequate for survival but not comfortable living. The conditions were harsh, but not deliberately cruel. It wasn't slavery in the chattel sense, but it wasn't freedom in the meaningful sense either. If you were skilled labour, mason or carpenter or artist, you had slightly better conditions. You might work year-round on major projects. You might receive a house in a workers' village. You might get higher quality rations, but you were still fundamentally owned by the state, which decided where you worked, what you built, and how much you got paid for the privilege of exhausting yourself in the desert sun. The workers' villages were company towns before capitalism invented company towns. Deir el Medina, the village for the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, was a walled settlement in the middle of nowhere. The workers lived there. Their families lived there. They were paid in rations. They shopped at state-run stores. They couldn't leave without permission, which is ancient Egyptian for, "We built you a nice prison with regular meal service." The work itself was brutal. Moving stones without modern machinery meant human chains, wooden sledges and ropes. Lots of ropes. Archaeological evidence shows workers suffered from arthritis, spinal compression, and repetitive stress injuries at remarkably young ages. A man in his 30s had the skeletal wear patterns of a modern 70-year-old, which means your body was collateral damage for pharaonic ambition. And if you got injured, medical care was available but limited. Ancient Egyptian medicine was surprisingly sophisticated in some areas and completely superstitious in others. They could set bones, they could stitch wounds, they could perform basic surgery. They had an extensive pharmacopoeia including some genuinely effective treatments. But they also believed that disease was caused by angry gods, evil spirits, and bad air, which meant treatment involved prayer, amulets, and incantations alongside actual medical intervention. The medical papyri, which read like a combination of clinical textbook and spellbook, provide recipes for healing everything from headaches to crocodile bites. Some remedies made sense. Honey for wounds, which actually has antibacterial properties. Willow bark for pain, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Other remedies were less scientific. Lizard blood for baldness, donkey dung for splinters, dead mouse paste for various ailments, because apparently ancient Egyptian medicine believed in confronting disease with increasing levels of unpleasantness, until one side surrendered. If you developed a serious infection, your options were limited. Antibiotics didn't exist. Antiseptic understanding was rudimentary. Surgery without anesthesia was an option, but not an appealing one. Alcohol could dull pain slightly, but ancient Egyptian beer wasn't strong enough to render anyone unconscious, which meant if you needed an amputation, you experienced the entire procedure fully aware while several strong men held you down, and a physician with a bronze knife worked quickly. Survival rates for major surgery were probably low. Survival rates for infections were definitely low. Life expectancy was approximately 30 to 35 years, which sounds grim until you realise that figure includes massive infant and childhood mortality. If you survived to age 5, you might make it to 45. If you survived to age 15, you might make it to 50. But surviving childhood was a significant accomplishment. Infant mortality was probably around 30%. Child mortality before age 5 was probably around 50%. which meant families had many children with the understanding that not all of them would survive. Childhood wasn't innocence and play. It was a prolonged audition for adulthood that half the participants failed. The causes of death were diverse and enthusiastic: infections, parasites, malnutrition, dehydration, crocodile attacks, hippo attacks, scorpion stings, snake bites, accidents during construction, accidents during childbirth, which killed both mothers and infants with impressive regularity. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was attended by midwives who had empirical knowledge but no formal training and no tools beyond their hands. Complications meant death. Breech births meant death. Hemorrhaging meant death. Infection after delivery meant death. Women who survived childbirth multiple times were considered blessed by Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, who was depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright. Which makes sense when you realise hippos are protective, dangerous, and associated with the Nile. Less sense when you realise they're also aggressive and kill more people annually than crocodiles. But ancient Egyptian theology wasn't worried about mixed messaging. Let's talk about housing, because apparently surviving ancient Egypt meant living somewhere, and that somewhere was probably uncomfortable. Most people lived in mud brick houses made from Nile mud mixed with straw, shaped into blocks, and dried in the sun. Rain could dissolve mud brick walls, but Egypt had almost no rain. The Nile Valley received maybe an inch of rain per year. But mud brick homes had the thermal properties of an oven. During summer, temperatures inside regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. During winter nights, temperatures could drop below 50 degrees. The roof was often the most comfortable part of the house, especially during summer nights. Families would sleep on the roof where the air was slightly cooler. But roofs were flat and poorly constructed, which meant falling through your own roof was a legitimate concern. Furniture was minimal. Most people sat on the floor. They slept on reed mats. Lighting came from oil lamps that produced a dim, flickering light. Nighttime was for sleeping or sitting in the dark. Sanitation was rudimentary. Most people used outdoor latrines or designated areas that became communal waste zones. The Nile was always available for waste disposal. Garbage accumulated everywhere. Food scraps attracted rodents and flies. Fire was a constant threat. Cooking happened over open flames. Houses were made of dried mud and straw. Climate was constant harassment. Egypt had 2 seasons, hot and slightly less hot. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was a hostile force that could kill through heat exhaustion and dehydration. Winter offered mild relief. Temperatures during the day were comfortable, maybe 70 to 80 degrees. But nights could be cold, especially in desert regions. The Khamsin wind arrived in spring, blowing hot, dry air from the Sahara across Egypt for days at a time. The wind carried sand that penetrated everything. Your house, your food, your eyes, your lungs. Let's talk about social hierarchy, because apparently ancient Egypt wasn't just geographically hostile. It was also structurally hostile. Egyptian society was rigidly stratified. At the top was the pharaoh, who was divine. Not divinely appointed, actually divine. A living god whose word was law and whose whims could reshape your entire existence. Below the pharaoh were the nobles and priests, who controlled land, managed resources, and mediated between the divine and the merely mortal. Below them were scribes, who could read and write, and therefore had power in a society that ran on documentation. Below scribes were skilled workers, artisans and soldiers. Below them were farmers and labourers. At the bottom were slaves, though slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't the same as later systems. Slaves had some rights, and could sometimes buy their freedom. But here's the thing. Social mobility was nearly non-existent. If you were born a farmer, you would die a farmer. Your children would be farmers. Your grandchildren would be farmers. The state controlled everything: land ownership, labour assignments, food distribution, religious practice, even death and burial. There were rules, procedures. Proper mummification required specific priests, specific materials, and specific rituals, which cost money most people didn't have. Poor people were buried in shallow graves in the desert, wrapped in reed mats if they were lucky. The hot, dry sand naturally mummified them through dehydration. No tomb, no grave goods, no Book of the Dead, just sand and hope. The religion itself was complicated in ways that make modern theology look straightforward. Ancient Egyptians worshipped hundreds of gods, and those gods had overlapping responsibilities, conflicting mythologies, and regional variations that changed depending on which part of Egypt you inhabited. Ra was the sun god, except sometimes he was Amun-Ra, or Ra-Horakhti, or Atum-Ra. It depended on the dynasty, the location, and which priests you asked. Osiris was the god of the afterlife and resurrection, except he was also murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, scattered across Egypt, reassembled by his wife Isis, and then became the ruler of the underworld, which is Egyptian mythology for we workshop our stories through multiple traumatic iterations. The afterlife itself required extensive preparation and knowledge. When you died, your Ka and Be, which were components of your soul, would separate from your body. Your body needed to be preserved through mummification so your Ka had somewhere to return. Your Bia, depicted as a bird with a human head, needed to be able to travel between the tomb and the afterlife. Your tomb needed supplies for the journey, food, water, tools, money, a copy of the Book of the Dead, which was essentially a guidebook for navigating the underworld. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single book. It was a collection of spells, instructions, and passwords that would help you pass various tests and challenges in the afterlife. You needed to know the names of gatekeepers. You needed to recite the correct incantations. You needed to pass the weighing of the heart ceremony, where your heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. If your heart was lighter than the feather, you passed into the field of reeds, which was basically Egypt but better. If your heart was heavier than the feather, you failed, and Amit, a demon with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippo, devoured your heart, and you ceased to exist. No pressure. The catch was that most people couldn't afford proper mummification, elaborate tombs, or copies of the Book of the Dead. Those were for pharaohs, nobles, and wealthy individuals. Everyone else got the sand burial and hoped for the best, which meant the afterlife, like everything else in ancient Egypt, was stratified by wealth and access. Meanwhile, you still had to live in the present, which was its own challenge. Let's talk about crime and punishment, because apparently ancient Egypt had laws, and those laws were enforced with enthusiasm. Theft was common. Property crime was rampant. Violence happened. Murder happened. And when you were caught, the legal system was not gentle. Trials were conducted by local officials or, for serious crimes, by the vizier or pharaoh. There were no lawyers, no defense attorneys, no presumption of innocence. You were accused. Evidence was presented. Sometimes torture was used to extract confessions, because apparently ancient Egyptians believed pain was an excellent truth serum. Then judgment was rendered. Punishments varied. Minor crimes might result in beatings, fines, or forced labour. Serious crimes could result in mutilation, cutting off noses, cutting off ears, cutting off hands. The logic was that visible mutilation served as both punishment and deterrent. Everyone would know you were a criminal because your face or hands advertised your transgression. Capital punishment was reserved for the most serious offences: murder, treason, tomb robbery, which was considered both theft and sacrilege. Execution methods included beheading, burning, or being fed to crocodiles. The last option was efficient, poetic, and eliminated the need for burial arrangements. Call it environmental sentencing. Tomb robbery was particularly offensive to ancient Egyptian sensibilities. Tombs were sacred. They contained the deceased's possessions for the afterlife. They were sealed and protected by curses, or at least by threats of curses, which should have deterred theft. But hunger and poverty are powerful motivators, and a sealed tomb full of gold, jewellery, and valuable grave goods was an attractive target when your family was starving. Professional tomb robbers developed techniques for breaching tombs without triggering structural collapses. They worked in teams. They had inside information from corrupt officials who knew which tombs contained the best loot. They operated at night. They fenced stolen goods through merchants who didn't ask questions. It was organised crime before organised crime had branding. When tomb robbers were caught, trials were public spectacles. Confessions were extracted through torture. Punishment was swift and brutal, and yet tomb robbery continued, because the rewards outweighed the risks, and desperation makes people remarkably creative about circumventing consequences. Let's talk about entertainment, because apparently ancient Egyptians needed occasional distraction from the relentless grind of survival. Sports existed. Wrestling was popular. Hunting was both practical and recreational. Wealthy individuals hunted in the marshes with throw sticks, targeting birds and small game. Pharaohs hunted lions, which was dangerous, expensive, and excellent propaganda. Board games were common. Senet was the most popular, a game involving strategy, luck, and movement across a board with 30 squares. The rules are disputed because ancient Egyptians didn't leave detailed instructions, which is frustrating for modern archaeologists who want to recreate authentic ancient gameplay. But we know Senet was played by everyone from pharaohs to workers, and the game had religious significance. Winning at Senet was metaphorically connected to successfully navigating the afterlife. Music was important. Harps, flutes, drums, and lyres provided entertainment at festivals and banquets. Wealthy households employed musicians. Temples employed sacred musicians for religious ceremonies. Music accompanied work. Music accompanied celebrations. Music accompanied funerals. Ancient Egypt was not a quiet civilization. Dancing happened. Acrobatics happened. Storytelling happened. Festivals celebrating various gods occurred throughout the year, providing scheduled breaks from labor and opportunities for communal gathering. The Opet festival honored Amun-Ra. The beautiful feast of the valley honored the dead. The festival of drunkenness honored Hathor and involved, unsurprisingly, drinking. But entertainment was limited by social class. Wealthy people attended elaborate banquets with entertainment, exotic foods, and imported wine. Poor people attended local festivals, drank beer, and watched performances from a distance. Leisure time itself was limited. Most people worked constantly. Rest days existed but were infrequent. Life was primarily labor, with occasional pauses for eating, sleeping, and reproduction. Let's talk about women, because ancient Egyptian women had more rights than women in many contemporary civilizations, which sounds progressive until you realize the baseline was extremely low. Women could own property, they could initiate divorce, they could conduct business, they could inherit wealth. These were significant freedoms compared to other ancient societies where women were essentially property. But that doesn't mean ancient. Egypt was a feminist paradise. Women were still primarily responsible for domestic labor, childcare, cooking, textile production, managing the household. Women could work outside the home in specific professions. They could be musicians, dancers, priestesses, midwives, professional mourners, or weavers. But most occupations, especially prestigious occupations like scribe or architect, were closed to women. Wealthy women had more options. They could manage estates. They could engage in trade. They had servants to handle domestic work. Poor women worked constantly, both inside and outside the home, and still bore primary responsibility for children and household management. Marriage was pragmatic rather than romantic. Marriages were arranged to consolidate property, form alliances, or ensure family continuity. Love was not a prerequisite. Compatibility was not a concern. You married who your family chose and you made it work, or you didn't, and you divorced if the situation became intolerable. Divorce was possible but socially complicated. Women could initiate divorce, but they often lost access to children and property. Men could divorce easily and remarry without social penalty. Divorced women faced limited remarriage prospects, especially if they had children. The system allowed divorce, but the practical consequences discouraged it. Contraception existed, sort of. Ancient Egyptians had recipes for contraceptive pessaries involving honey, acacia, and other substances inserted vaginally. Some of these methods might have had limited effectiveness. Acacia ferments into lactic acid, which can act as a mild spermicide. But mostly these methods were hopeful chemistry, based on limited understanding of reproductive biology. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth was frequently fatal. Maternal mortality was high, infant mortality was higher, and surviving multiple childbirths was an achievement worthy of divine favour. Women who survived childbearing years were often physically damaged by repeated pregnancies, difficult deliveries, and inadequate medical care. Let's talk about education, or the lack thereof. Formal education was reserved for the elite, specifically boys from wealthy families who were trained to become scribes. Scribe schools taught reading, writing, mathematics, and administrative skills. Training was rigorous. Students memorized thousands of hieroglyphic symbols. They practiced writing on pottery shards and limestone flakes because papyrus was expensive. They studied classic texts. They learned accounting. Discipline was strict. Teachers used corporal punishment liberally. Beatings were considered normal educational tools. One surviving text instructs teachers, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten," which is ancient Egyptian for, "We solved classroom management through violence." Most children received no formal education. They learned through apprenticeship and observation. Farmers' children learned farming. Potters' children learned pottery. Knowledge was transmitted generationally within families and professions. Literacy remained around 1% of the population because reading and writing were specialized skills controlled by a professional class that had no incentive to expand access. The consequence was a society where written documentation controlled everything, but almost nobody could read that documentation. Contracts, laws, taxes, religious texts, historical records, all written in scripts that most people couldn't decipher. Scribes had immense power because they controlled information flow. They could read official communications, draft legal documents, and manage administrative systems that governed everyone's lives. Corruption was inevitable. Scribes could forge documents. They could alter tax records. They could fabricate evidence. Oversight was limited because oversight required literacy, and literate individuals were scarce and often complicit in the same systems they were supposed to monitor. Let's talk about the military, because ancient Egypt was not a peaceful civilization despite its geographic advantages. Desert borders provided natural defense, but that didn't prevent conflict. Egypt fought wars, many wars, against Nubians to the south, Libyans to the west, various Asiatic peoples to the northeast. The military was necessary, and military service was mandatory for many young men. Soldiers were conscripted or recruited. Professional soldiers existed, but most military manpower came from temporary drafts during campaign seasons. Training was basic. Weapons were simple. Infantry carried spears, shields, and sometimes swords. Archers used composite bows. Charioteers, introduced during the New Kingdom, formed an elite unit. Military life was harsh. Soldiers marched long distances in brutal heat. They fought in hand-to-hand combat with bronze weapons that bent, broke, and required constant maintenance. Injuries were common. Medical care was limited. Death was frequent. Captured soldiers faced slavery or execution. Defeated cities were sacked. Populations were enslaved. War was not conducted according to modern humanitarian principles. Victory brought rewards. Successful soldiers received land, slaves, and status. But most soldiers weren't particularly successful. They served their required time, survived if they were lucky, and returned home to resume farming or labour. Military service was an obligation, not an opportunity for most Egyptians. Foreign policy was aggressive when Egypt was strong and defensive when Egypt was weak. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom expanded Egyptian control into Nubia and the Levant through military conquest. They built fortresses, they installed governors, they extracted tribute. This was empire before Romans perfected empire, but empire requires maintenance, garrisons, supply lines, administrative oversight. And when central authority weakened during intermediate periods, those territories broke away, tribute stopped flowing, and Egypt contracted back to its Nile Valley core. Power was cyclical. Expansion followed by fragmentation, followed by reunification, followed by expansion. The pattern repeated across 3,000 years. Let's talk about technology, or rather the lack of revolutionary technological advancement. Ancient Egypt was technologically sophisticated for the Bronze Age, but it was also technologically conservative. Once Egyptians developed effective methods, they used those methods for centuries without significant innovation. Mud brick construction, copper and bronze tools, traditional agricultural techniques. These worked, so why change them? The wheel was known but underutilized. Wheeled vehicles existed but were rare. The Nile provided transportation, making wheeled carts less necessary for moving goods. Roads were minimal. Most travel happened by boat or on foot. This worked within Egypt's geographical context, but it also limited certain types of development. Iron was late to arrive. While other civilizations began adopting iron technology around 1200 BCE, Egypt continued using bronze until much later. This wasn't ignorance. Egyptians knew about iron. But bronze was familiar, Egypt had reliable copper sources, and conservative craft traditions resisted change. By the time Egypt fully adopted iron technology, other civilizations had already been using iron for centuries. Innovation happened slowly and incrementally. Agricultural tools improved marginally over centuries. Building techniques became more sophisticated. Medical knowledge expanded. But there were no sudden technological revolutions that transformed Egyptian society fundamentally. This stability was both strength and weakness. It provided continuity but limited adaptability. Meanwhile, daily life remained remarkably consistent across dynasties. A farmer during the Old Kingdom would have recognized the lifestyle of a farmer during the New Kingdom, even though 1,000 years separated them. The Nile still flooded. Bread and beer were still staples. The pharaoh was still divine. Work was still exhausting. Death was still common. Some things apparently don't change just because time passes. Let's talk about foreign influence, because ancient Egypt wasn't isolated despite geographic barriers. Trade routes connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and Nubia. Goods flowed in and out. Cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Egyptian grain, linen and papyrus went outward. Ideas and cultural practices followed trade goods. The Hyksos invasion during the Second Intermediate Period brought new military technology, including composite bows and horse-drawn chariots. Egyptians initially resisted these innovations but eventually adopted and refined them, creating formidable chariot corps that dominated later military campaigns. Foreign conquest prompted technological adaptation, which is ancient Egyptian for "we learn when forced to learn." The Sea Peoples crisis around 1200 BCE demonstrated Egypt's vulnerability. These mysterious invaders, whose origins remain disputed, attacked multiple civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt survived but was weakened. The Bronze Age collapse disrupted trade networks, eliminated allied kingdoms, and ushered in a period of instability that affected Egypt economically and militarily. Later, Egypt was conquered by Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. Each conquest brought new rulers, new administrative systems, and new cultural influences. But underneath those changes, the fundamental patterns of Egyptian life persisted. The Nile still flooded. Farmers still grew wheat and barley. Workers still moved stones. The names of gods might change, but the prayers remained similar. Let's talk about animals, because ancient Egypt was full of creatures that ranged from useful to murderous. Donkeys provided transportation. Oxen pulled ploughs. Goats and cattle provided milk, meat, and leather. Dogs served as guards and hunting companions. Wealthy individuals kept exotic animals as status symbols. Cats were special. They were associated with Bastet, the goddess of home and protection. They controlled rodent populations. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a serious offence. But let's not romanticize animal welfare. Working animals were tools. They were used until they broke. Most animals worked hard, lived short lives, and died young. Sacred animals existed in specific temple complexes. The Apis bull at Memphis lived in luxury. When it died, it was mummified and buried with elaborate ceremony. These sacred animals were exceptions. Regular animals existed to serve human needs. Let's talk about old age, assuming you were remarkably lucky and survived to experience it. If you survived to adulthood and avoided death by infection or injury, you might reach your 50s or 60s. Not comfortably, but you might reach them. Aging was physically brutal. Decades of manual labour destroyed joints and spines. Arthritis was universal. Dental attrition continued until teeth were gone, making eating difficult. Physical strength diminished. There was no retirement, no pension. If you couldn't work, you depended on family to support you. This worked if your family had surplus resources. Old people were theoretically respected for their wisdom, but respect doesn't provide food. Let's talk about children, specifically what childhood actually looked like beyond the mortality statistics. Children who survived infancy entered a world that had no concept of childhood as a protected phase of life. You were small adults. By age 5, children were performing simple tasks: fetching water, watching younger siblings, helping with food preparation. By age 8, children were working alongside adults in fields or workshops. Boys learned their father's trade through observation and practice. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. There was no formal separation between childhood and work. You contributed as soon as you were physically capable. Play existed but was limited. Children had toys, small carved animals, dolls made from scraps, balls made from leather and papyrus, simple games. But playtime was squeezed between labour and survival. You played when work was finished, which wasn't often, and you stopped playing early because work needed doing. Entertainment was a luxury most families couldn't afford to prioritise. By early teenage years, you were expected to perform adult work at adult levels. Adolescence as a distinct life stage didn't exist. You transitioned directly from childhood labour to adult labour, marked by physical maturity and marriage. Girls married young, often in their early teens, to much older men. Boys began full adult responsibilities around the same age, taking on complete work duties and eventually starting families of their own. The transition to adulthood was abrupt and unforgiving. One day, you were learning. The next day, you were responsible for production quotas, family support, and all the obligations that came with being a contributing member of society. There was no gradual easing into responsibility. You learned fast, adapted quickly, or struggled. And struggling in ancient Egypt had consequences. Marriage itself deserves closer examination because it was transactional, in ways modern people find uncomfortable to acknowledge. Marriage was an economic arrangement. Two families exchanging resources, labour, and social connections. Love might develop, or it might not. That wasn't the primary concern. The primary concern was whether the union benefited both families materially. Bride wealth was common. The groom's family provided goods, animals, or money to the bride's family as compensation for losing her labour. This wasn't buying a wife exactly. It was recognising that the bride's family was losing a worker and needed compensation. The bride brought a dowry, which remained her property and could support her if the marriage ended in divorce or widowhood. Wedding ceremonies themselves were relatively simple. No elaborate rituals, no religious requirements. Marriage was a civil contract, not a religious sacrament. You agreed to marry, your families agreed. You moved in together. That was it. The marriage was formalised through cohabitation and public acknowledgement, not through ceremony. Polygamy was legal but rare. Only wealthy men could afford multiple wives, and even then it was unusual. Most people were monogamous because supporting one family was difficult enough. Supporting multiple families required resources most Egyptians didn't have. Married life was pragmatic. Husbands worked, wives managed households and worked in whatever capacity their social class allowed. Children arrived regularly. Some survived. Marriages lasted until death or divorce, whichever came first. Romance was not expected. Companionship was possible but not guaranteed. You made it work because the alternative was social isolation and economic insecurity. Let's talk about communication, or the challenges thereof. Most people couldn't read or write. Information spread through oral transmission. News travelled by word of mouth. Instructions were delivered verbally. Stories were memorised and recited. This system worked but had obvious limitations. Misunderstandings were common. Details got distorted as information passed through multiple people. Official proclamations might be misinterpreted when translated from written decree to spoken announcement to community understanding. Legal disputes arose from differing recollections of verbal agreements. Written contracts existed for important transactions, but you needed a scribe to draft them and another scribe to read them back to you, assuming both scribes were honest. Distance made communication slower. Messages between cities travelled at walking speed or boat speed, depending on whether you sent a runner or used the Nile. Urgent news took days or weeks to travel the length of Egypt. By the time you learned about an event, circumstances had often changed. This information lag affected everything from trade to military responses to family emergencies. The Nile facilitated communication to some degree. Boats travelled faster than people walked, and the current flowed north while prevailing winds blew south, making two-way travel relatively efficient. But you still needed time. Messages from the Delta to Aswan took weeks, and that assumed your messenger survived the journey, which wasn't guaranteed given the various dangers already discussed. Let's talk about personal identity, because ancient Egyptians had interesting approaches to names and identification. Names were important. They identified you legally, socially, and spiritually. Your name could affect your afterlife. Erasing someone's name from monuments was a form of damnatio memoriae that destroyed their posthumous existence, which is ancient Egyptian for we take naming seriously. Most people had simple names, descriptive names, names referencing gods, names indicating birth order or circumstances. Rameses meant Ra has fashioned him. Amenhotep meant Amun is satisfied. Nefertiti meant the beautiful one has come. Names had meaning and conveyed identity. But here's the complication. Ancient Egyptians didn't have surnames in the modern sense. They had personal names and maybe a patronymic or title if they were important enough. Most people were identified by personal name, father's name, and occupation or place of origin. This system worked in small communities where everyone knew everyone. It worked less well in larger administrative contexts where you needed to distinguish between multiple people with the same name. Record-keeping was essential for administration and taxation. Scribes maintained census records, tax records, and legal documents. They tracked property ownership, grain production, and labour obligations. These records were necessary for running a centralised state, but they were also vulnerable to loss, damage, and deliberate falsification. Fires destroyed archives. Floods damaged papyrus. Corrupt officials altered records for personal gain. Let's talk about law enforcement, because ancient Egypt had crime, and therefore needed systems for preventing and punishing crime. Police forces existed, sort of. The Medjay, originally Nubian warriors, became a police force responsible for security in the Nile Valley and desert regions. They guarded tombs, patrolled trade routes, and maintained order in communities. But law enforcement was limited by technology and resources. No fingerprinting, no forensic science, no surveillance systems. Crime investigation relied on witness testimony, confessions, and physical evidence when available. Most cases were resolved through local dispute resolution rather than formal legal processes. Community elders or local officials mediated conflicts, assigned compensation, and resolved disputes before they escalated to higher authorities. Serious crimes went to higher courts. Theft, murder, and major property disputes were handled by regional officials or the vizier's court. Punishments were public to serve as deterrents. Beatings were administered in public squares. Mutilations were visible warnings. Executions were community events. The message was clear. Crime had consequences, and those consequences were neither private nor gentle. Prisons existed but were temporary holding facilities rather than long-term punishment. You were imprisoned while awaiting trial or punishment, not as the punishment itself. Ancient Egypt didn't have the resources or infrastructure to maintain large prison populations. Punishment was swift, physical, and designed to return you to productivity as quickly as possible, or remove you from society permanently if you were deemed irredeemable. Let's talk about mental health, a concept that didn't exist in ancient Egypt but manifested anyway because human psychology operates independent of cultural recognition. Depression existed. Anxiety existed. Trauma existed. Post-traumatic stress from violence, loss, and hardship affected people just as it affects people today. But there was no framework for understanding these as medical conditions. Mental distress was attributed to supernatural causes, possession by demons, curses from enemies, punishment from gods. Treatment involved religious rituals, amulets, and incantations rather than what we would recognize as psychiatric care. Some remedies might have provided psychological comfort through ritual and belief, but they didn't address underlying conditions. People suffering from severe mental illness were probably marginalized. Communities might have tolerated mild eccentricity, but severe disturbances that prevented productive labor or threatened community order would have resulted in exclusion. There was no institutional support, no asylums or hospitals for mental treatment. You either managed within family support systems, or you became one of the vulnerable individuals on society's margins. The stress of daily survival probably contributed to chronic psychological distress. Uncertainty about floods, fear of famine, loss of children to disease, physical pain from injuries and chronic conditions. These weren't occasional stresses. They were constant background conditions of existence, and there was no therapy, no medication, no systematic approach to managing psychological well-being. You endured, or you didn't. Let's talk about leisure, or the relative scarcity of it. Leisure time was a luxury. Most people worked constantly. Survival required continuous effort. Fields needed tending, animals needed care, households needed management, construction projects needed labour. There was always work, and work didn't stop for convenience or preference. Festivals provided scheduled breaks. Religious celebrations occurred throughout the year, marking agricultural cycles, honouring gods, and commemorating historical events. During festivals, normal work paused. People gathered for communal activities. There was food, music, and entertainment. These breaks were essential pressure release valves in otherwise relentless schedules. But festivals were exceptions, not rules. Most days were work days. Most time was productive time. The concept of weekend leisure didn't exist. The concept of vacation didn't exist. The concept of retirement didn't exist. You worked from childhood through old age, with only festivals and physical incapacity providing respite. Wealthy individuals had more leisure time. They could delegate work to servants and slaves. They could pursue entertainment, enjoy elaborate meals, and engage in activities that had no productive value. This leisure was built on others' labour. Every hour a nobleman spent hunting or attending banquets was paid for by hours of labour, from workers who provided the resources that funded that leisure. Let's talk about natural disasters beyond the predictable floods. Earthquakes happened, Egypt sits on tectonic boundaries, and seismic activity occurred periodically throughout history. Buildings collapsed, people died, stored goods were destroyed, and recovery was slow because reconstruction required labour and resources that might not be immediately available. Plagues affected both humans and animals. Epidemic diseases swept through populations: bubonic plague, typhus, smallpox. We can't diagnose ancient diseases with certainty, but archaeological and historical evidence suggests periodic epidemics killed significant portions of the population. And without understanding of germ theory or disease transmission, prevention was impossible, and treatment was largely ineffective. Crop diseases affected harvests. Blights, fungi, and pests could destroy wheat and barley crops. Locust swarms occasionally descended and consumed everything. These agricultural disasters caused famines that killed more people than the initial crop loss. Hunger leads to disease. Disease leads to death. The cascading effects of crop failure extended far beyond immediate food scarcity. Droughts were devastating. If the Nile flood failed or was insufficient, irrigation couldn't compensate. Wells ran dry. Water sources diminished. People and animals died of thirst before they died of hunger, and droughts could last multiple years, compounding the disaster. The historical record includes references to multi-year droughts that depopulated regions and destabilized dynasties. Let's talk about travel, because moving around ancient Egypt was possible but neither easy nor safe. The Nile provided the main transportation corridor. Boats travelled downstream with the current, upstream with sails catching prevailing northern winds. This system was efficient for north-south travel but required boats, which not everyone owned. Walking was common. Donkeys carried loads. Camels arrived later and weren't widespread during most of ancient Egyptian history. Most travel happened on foot, which was slow, exhausting, and exposed travellers to dangers. Desert travel was particularly hazardous. Heat, dehydration, getting lost, and encounters with dangerous animals were all legitimate concerns. Roads were minimal. Paths existed between settlements, but maintained roads were rare outside major administrative centres and ceremonial routes. You followed established paths through agricultural land or desert, and those paths could be difficult to navigate, especially in unfamiliar territory. Bandits operated along trade routes and in desert regions. Travelling with valuable goods or visible wealth invited attack. Solo travelers were vulnerable. Even group travel couldn't guarantee safety against organized bandit groups who knew the terrain and specialized in robbery. Travel for pleasure didn't exist for most people. You traveled for work, trade, military service, or pilgrimage. You didn't take trips to see new places or experience different regions. Travel was necessary but not enjoyable. It was dangerous, uncomfortable, and something you did only when required. Foreign travel was even more complicated. Leaving Egypt required official permission. Border controls existed to regulate movement and prevent unauthorized departure. The state wanted to control its population and ensure people fulfilled their labor obligations. You couldn't just decide to leave and start a new life elsewhere. Emigration wasn't a personal choice. It was a violation of state authority. Traders, diplomats, and military personnel traveled outside Egypt regularly. But these were official travelers with documentation and purpose. They represented the state or conducted authorized business. Regular people didn't travel internationally. They lived and died within relatively small geographic ranges, never seeing more than a few dozen miles from their birthplace. Let's talk about bureaucracy, because ancient Egypt was obsessively bureaucratic. Record keeping was extensive. Tax collectors documented harvests. Scribes recorded labor obligations. Officials tracked property transfers. The state knew, or tried to know, everything about its population and resources. This bureaucracy enabled centralized control, but also created opportunities for corruption and error. Tax collection was particularly thorough. Officials assessed fields after each harvest. They calculated taxes based on land area and expected yield. They collected payment in grain, which was stored in state granaries. Tax evasion was difficult because officials measured fields directly and monitored harvests. But honest assessment depended on honest officials, and honest officials were not universal. Bribery was common. Officials could be convinced to underreport harvests or overreport damage from pests or weather. They could falsify records to benefit themselves or their associates. The bureaucratic system was extensive but not incorruptible. When central authority was strong, oversight limited corruption. When central authority weakened, corruption flourished. Labour conscription was similarly bureaucratic. Officials maintained lists of available workers. They assigned individuals to projects based on need and skill. They tracked attendance and completion. The system functioned reasonably well when administered competently, but competence varied. Some officials were efficient administrators, others were incompetent or corrupt. Your experience with state labour projects depended significantly on who was administering them. Personal hygiene deserves attention. Ancient Egyptians valued cleanliness. They bathed regularly when water was available. Wealthy individuals had servants pour water over them. Poor people bathed in the Nile. They used paste made from oil and lime as a cleaning agent. Shaving was common among priests and wealthy individuals. Men shaved their faces and heads. Women removed body hair. Shaving required bronze razors that could cause cuts and infections. Wigs were fashionable among the elite. They provided sun protection and style. Most people went bareheaded or wore simple head coverings. Dental hygiene was primitive. Some people used frayed twigs to clean teeth, but abrasive bread meant teeth wore down regardless of cleaning efforts. Cosmetics were surprisingly important. Eye makeup was universal. Kohl had antibacterial properties and reduced glare. Practical and decorative, perfumes and oils protected skin from harsh climate. They also masked body odour. Henna was used for body decoration and hair dyeing. Women and men applied henna to hands, feet and hair. Let's talk about textiles. Linen was ideal for Egypt's climate. Made from flax, linen was cool and absorbent. The wealthy wore fine linen. The poor wore coarse linen. Textile production was labour-intensive. Flax had to be grown, processed and spun. Thread was woven into fabric. Most textile production was domestic labour performed by women. Clothing styles were simple. Men wore kilts or loincloths. Women wore simple dresses. Children often went naked because clothing was expensive. The wealthy had multiple garments. The poor had one or two outfits. Footwear was optional. Most people went barefoot. Sandals were expensive and wore out quickly. Poor people developed tough, calloused feet. Let's talk about infrastructure, or the relative lack of it. Egypt built impressive temples and tombs, but invested less in practical infrastructure. Irrigation was essential, and received attention. Canals and basins captured floodwater. Shadoffs lifted water, but there were no aqueducts, no sophisticated water distribution. Sewage management was minimal, no sewer systems, no organised waste removal. People disposed of waste wherever was convenient. This created unsanitary conditions that contributed to disease. Roads were minimal, no paved highways, no maintained thoroughfares beyond ceremonial routes. You walked on dirt paths that became muddy during floods and dusty during dry seasons. The state invested in temples and tombs, not in projects that improved living conditions for the majority. Let's talk about neighbours and community relationships. Most people lived in villages where everyone knew everyone. This proximity created strong community bonds but also meant privacy was impossible. Your neighbours knew everything about your life. This created both support and pressure. Communities provided mutual aid. Neighbours helped with harvests and emergencies, but they also enforced social norms through gossip and judgment. Deviation from expected behaviour brought consequences. Disputes between neighbours were common. Property boundaries, shared resources, interpersonal conflicts. These required resolution because you couldn't avoid your neighbours. Local officials mediated disputes, attempting to restore peace. Community cooperation was essential for certain tasks. Irrigation required collective maintenance. Everyone benefited, so everyone contributed labour. Let's talk about superstition and daily beliefs. Egyptians believed in magic as a practical tool. Real magic that could affect outcomes. Amulets protected against evil. Spells could curse enemies or attract fortune. Ordinary people practiced folk magic. They wore protective amulets. They recited incantations before dangerous activities. They performed rituals to ensure harvests and safe childbirth. Curses were taken seriously. Whether curses worked through supernatural power or psychological impact was irrelevant. The results felt real. Dreams were considered significant. Prophetic dreams revealed future events. Dream interpretation was a recognized skill. Professional dream interpreters advised clients based on dream content. Omens governed behavior. Unusual animal behavior. Unexpected. Weather. Odd occurrences. These were interpreted as signs from gods. The natural world was constantly communicating, and people tried to decode those communications. Let's talk about food storage and preservation. Grain could be stored in dry conditions for extended periods. But perfect storage was impossible. Weevils, rats, and pests consumed stored grain. Moisture caused rot. Meat preservation required drying or salting. Fresh meat didn't last long. You either ate it immediately or preserved it. Salt enabled food preservation. Dried meat provided protein when fresh meat wasn't available. Fish could be salted, dried, or preserved in oil. Fruits and vegetables had limited storage potential. Some could be dried, but most produce had to be consumed quickly. You ate what was currently available. Beer and wine provided calories in liquid form. Fermentation preserved them to some degree, though beer had to be consumed fresh. Wine lasted longer but was expensive. Let's talk about boredom, an under-discussed aspect of pre-modern life. Work consumed most time, but even labour has monotonous aspects. Repetitive tasks, long hours, limited variation. Conversation was entertainment. Stories passed through oral tradition, local gossip. These provided mental stimulation within the constraints of small community life. But conversation only goes so far when everyone already knows everyone's business. Music required instruments and musicians. Not every village had accomplished musicians. Singing required no equipment but was limited by individual ability. The same songs repeated until they became background rather than active entertainment. Games provided distraction but had limited variety. You played the games you knew with people available. Once you exhausted the novelty, games became routine. The monotony of ancient life is often overlooked. Between crises and festivals, there were long stretches of repetitive labour and limited diversion. This was probably more psychologically wearing than the dramatic dangers that capture modern imagination. Let's talk about accidents, because ancient Egypt was full of ways to get hurt. Construction sites were dangerous. Moving heavy stones with primitive equipment meant ropes snapped, stones fell, and people were crushed. Scaffolding collapsed. Workers fell from heights. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, no insurance. You worked carefully, or you got hurt. Agricultural work had its own dangers. Irrigation ditches could collapse. Oxen could trample or gore you. Tools slipped and caused cuts. The scorching sun caused heat stroke. Dehydration killed workers who couldn't access water frequently enough. These weren't dramatic deaths. They were routine occupational hazards. Domestic accidents were common. Fires from cooking, burns from hot surfaces, falls from roofs, cuts from sharp tools. Children were especially vulnerable. They lacked the caution that comes from experience and the physical, coordination to avoid common dangers. Childhood accidents probably accounted for many of those mortality statistics beyond disease. Animal attacks happened regularly. Crocodiles lurked in the Nile and adjacent waterways. They attacked people collecting water, washing clothes, or fishing. Crocodiles were ambush predators that struck without warning and dragged victims underwater. Survival was unlikely once a crocodile had you. Death was swift or prolonged, depending on whether the crocodile killed you immediately or drowned you first. Hippos were territorial and aggressive. They killed more people than crocodiles. A hippo could bite a person in half with jaws strong enough to crush bone. They defended their territory viciously. They attacked boats that came too close. They chased people who wandered too near during territorial disputes. There was no outrunning a hippo on land. They could sprint faster than humans despite weighing several tons. Snakes were everywhere. Cobras, vipers, various venomous species that could deliver lethal bites. Most snake encounters probably resulted in the snake fleeing, but enough resulted in bites that snakebite was a recognized medical emergency. Treatment was limited. Some folk remedies might have helped marginally. Most victims either survived because the bite wasn't venomous enough to kill, or died because it was. Scorpions were smaller but equally dangerous. They hid in shoes, clothes, and bedding. Stepping on a scorpion or putting on clothing harbouring one resulted in painful stings. Most scorpion species weren't lethal to adults, but children and elderly individuals were more vulnerable. Even non-lethal stings caused intense pain, swelling, and illness that could last days. Let's talk about political instability, because ancient Egypt wasn't continuously stable for 3,000 years. There were periods of strength when central authority controlled the entire country, maintained order, and enforced laws. There were also intermediate periods when central authority collapsed. Regional powers fought for control, and ordinary people suffered the consequences. During stable periods, you knew what was expected. Taxes were predictable. Labour obligations were defined. Laws were enforced consistently. Trade functioned. Food distribution systems worked. Life was hard, but at least structured. During unstable periods, everything deteriorated. Tax collection became arbitrary, or ceased entirely. Bandits operated freely without law enforcement. Trade routes were dangerous or impassable. Food distribution broke down. Regional warlords fought each other, conscripting soldiers and confiscating resources. Ordinary people starved, died in conflicts, or fled to regions that seemed safer. The first intermediate period lasted over a century. The second intermediate period saw foreign Hyksos rulers control parts of Egypt. The third intermediate period fragmented Egypt into competing regions. These weren't minor disruptions. They were extended collapses of the social order that made life even more precarious than usual. During these periods, survival depended more on luck and location than ability or virtue. If you lived in a region controlled by a competent warlord who maintained some order, you might survive. If you lived in a contested region where multiple factions fought, you probably died or fled. The difference wasn't your choices, it was geography and timing. Let's talk about foreign invasions, because Egypt's geographic barriers weren't perfect. Invaders came from multiple directions across Egyptian history. Hyksos from the northeast, Libyans from the west, Nubians from the south, sea peoples from across the Mediterranean. Later Assyrians, Persians, Greeks and Romans. Invasions meant war. War meant conscription. Young men were taken for military service. Some returned, many didn't. Families lost primary workers, fields went untended, economic productivity declined. Even if you personally survived, the economic disruption affected everyone. Invasions also meant occupation and tribute. Foreign rulers extracted resources from Egypt just like Egyptian rulers did, but they lacked the cultural legitimacy that made exploitation more tolerable. Egyptian pharaohs were divine. Foreign rulers were just foreigners extracting wealth. The psychological difference mattered even if the material conditions were similar. Some invasions brought cultural changes. New gods entered the pantheon, new administrative systems replaced old ones, new languages became necessary for dealing with authorities. These changes created additional stress. You had to adapt to foreign systems while maintaining enough traditional practice to preserve your identity and community bonds. Let's talk about maritime dangers, because the Nile and Mediterranean were both essential and dangerous. The Nile had currents, sandbars and sudden storms. Boats capsized, passengers drowned, cargo was lost, swimming ability varied. Many people probably couldn't swim well. Drowning was a significant cause of death, especially for children who fell into water or adults who capsized in boats. The Mediterranean was worse. Larger storms, rougher waters, greater distances between land. Ships were relatively primitive. They sailed close to shore when possible, but trade routes required open water crossings. Storms sank ships. Pirates attacked vessels. Navigation errors left ships lost. Maritime trade was profitable but extremely risky. Fishermen faced daily risks. Small boats on the Nile or Mediterranean could overturn. Equipment could fail. Weather could turn suddenly. Fishing was necessary work that paid poorly and killed regularly. It was one of many occupations where the danger was accepted as unavoidable rather than extraordinary. Let's talk about fuel and energy, because running a household required burning something. Wood was scarce. Egypt had few forests. Most wood was imported and expensive, common. People burned other fuels: dried dung from cattle and donkeys, dried reeds and papyrus, agricultural waste. These fuels burned dirty, produced noxious smoke, and provided less heat than wood. Cooking over dung fires meant inhaling smoke daily. Indoor air quality was terrible. Respiratory diseases were probably common from chronic smoke exposure. But you needed fire to cook. You needed fire for warmth during cold nights. You needed fire for light. There was no avoiding smoke exposure. You breathed it and dealt with the consequences. Fuel collection was constant work. Animal dung had to be collected, shaped into cakes and dried. Reeds had to be gathered and dried. Agricultural waste had to be salvaged. This was usually women's work, added to all their other responsibilities. Fuel scarcity meant you used fire conservatively. You cooked efficiently. You didn't waste heat. Every flame had to serve multiple purposes. Let's talk about noise, because ancient Egypt wasn't quiet. Villages were dense. People lived close together. Sounds carried. Conversations, arguments, children playing, animals making noise, construction, grinding grain, textile work. Daily life generated constant ambient noise. Privacy through quiet was impossible. Everyone heard everyone else's business. Domestic disputes were public knowledge. Illness was obvious from groaning or coughing. Children crying at night woke neighbours. The lack of sound insulation meant all activities were audible to those nearby. This constant noise probably contributed to stress and conflict. You couldn't escape to quiet spaces easily. The desert offered silence but also danger and discomfort. Your home was noisy. The street was noisy. Work sites were noisy. Festivals were intentionally noisy with music and celebration. Silence was rare and possibly unsettling when encountered. Let's talk about religious obligations, because religion wasn't optional. Religious observance was civic duty. You participated in festivals. You made offerings at temples if you could afford them. You observed religious restrictions on behavior and food. These obligations took time and resources. Festivals were enjoyable but also expensive. You were expected to celebrate. That meant special food, new clothing if possible, and time away from productive work. Wealthy families could afford elaborate celebrations. Poor families stretched resources to participate minimally. Not participating was socially unacceptable and potentially dangerous. Piety was public performance. Pilgrimages to sacred sites were undertaken for religious merit or to fulfill vows. These journeys cost time and money. You had to travel, provide for yourself during travel, make offerings at the destination, and return. The spiritual benefits might have been significant, but the material costs were real. Poor people balanced religious obligation against economic necessity. Personal devotion required maintaining household shrines, making regular offerings, and performing daily prayers or rituals. These practices were integrated into daily routines but still required effort and resources. You couldn't simply ignore religious duties. Social pressure and personal belief both compelled compliance. Let's talk about debt, because ancient Egypt had credit and therefore debt problems. If your harvest failed or you faced unexpected expenses, you borrowed. From neighbours, from merchants, from temples that sometimes functioned as lenders. Debt created obligations. Interest rates could be high. Repayment terms varied. If you couldn't repay, you might lose property, sell yourself or family members into temporary servitude, or face legal consequences. Debt could trap families in cycles of obligation that lasted generations. Your debts could become your children's debts if you died before repaying. Debt slavery was temporary, not permanent. You worked for a creditor until the debt was satisfied. But temporary could last years. During that time, you had no autonomy. Your labour belonged to someone else. Your family might struggle without your income. The cycle perpetuated poverty. Some people avoided debt through careful management and luck. Others accumulated debts from circumstances beyond their control. Illness, injury, flood damage, theft. Bad luck in ancient Egypt could destroy your economic stability quickly, and recovering was difficult without accumulated resources or strong community support. Let's talk about family conflicts, because close quarters and limited resources created friction. Inheritance disputes were common. Egyptian law allowed women to inherit, but family members still fought over property division. Brothers disputed land boundaries. Children challenged wills. These conflicts fractured families and created lasting animosities. Domestic violence probably occurred but left little historical record. Power imbalances within families, stress from poverty, limited outlets for frustration. These conditions create domestic abuse in all societies, and ancient Egypt likely wasn't different. Women, children, and vulnerable family members bore the consequences of violence that had no external accountability. Intergenerational conflicts arose from differing priorities and expectations. Parents expected obedience and respect. Adult children wanted autonomy. Elderly parents needed support but might have been seen as burdens. These tensions existed in all pre-modern societies that lacked formal elderly care systems. Family obligation was powerful but also created resentment. Extended families often lived together or in close proximity. Multiple generations, multiple nuclear families. This created support networks but also complicated decision-making. Who had authority? How were resources divided? Who made sacrifices when necessary? These questions didn't have easy answers and probably generated ongoing conflicts that communities had to mediate. Let's talk about disabilities and chronic illness, because accidents, disease, and genetic conditions created disabled individuals who needed support in a society without formal disability accommodations. Blindness from infection, injury, or trachoma was relatively common. Blind individuals couldn't perform many types of work. They depended on family support or became beggars. Mobility impairments from injury, arthritis, or birth defects limited work options. Agricultural labour required physical capability. Construction required strength and mobility. If you couldn't perform physical labour, your economic options narrowed dramatically. Some disabled individuals found alternative work, musicians, storytellers. But opportunities were limited. Chronic illness from parasites, malnutrition, or other conditions meant ongoing disability without acute crisis. You were functional enough to survive, but not healthy enough to work productively. This created economic burden on families and communities. Some people received support, others were marginalised or abandoned. The elderly often developed disabilities as natural aging consequences. Vision deterioration, hearing loss, mobility problems, cognitive decline. These conditions had no treatment. You managed as best you could until you couldn't manage anymore. Then you hoped family would care for you until death. The alternative was grim. Let's talk about resource scarcity beyond food. Metal was valuable and scarce. Bronze tools were expensive and required skilled craftsmen to produce. Iron came late to Egypt and remained expensive when it arrived. Most people owned minimal metal tools, a knife, maybe a hoe or sickle. These tools were repaired repeatedly, sharpened constantly, and treasured. When metal tools broke beyond repair, replacing them was difficult. You needed money or trade goods to commission new tools from smiths. If you couldn't afford replacement, you made do with less efficient alternatives, stone tools for some tasks, wooden implements for others, but productivity suffered without proper tools. Pottery was essential for storage and cooking. Clay was available, but shaping and firing pottery required skill. Most families owned basic ceramic vessels but could afford little more. Broken pottery could sometimes be repaired. Otherwise, you lived with fewer containers and adjusted your storage and cooking accordingly. Rope and cordage were constantly needed and constantly wearing out. Rope was made from papyrus, flax, or palm fibre through labour-intensive processes. Strong rope was expensive. Most rope you used was probably rough, weak, and requiring frequent replacement. This affected everything from drawing water to securing loads to repairing structures. Let's talk about information asymmetry, because literacy was rare and knowledge was power. Scribes controlled written information. They could read contracts accurately or deceptively. They could record transactions honestly or falsify them. You depended on their integrity. Legal. Documents bound you to terms you might not fully understand. Marriage contracts, property transfers, debt agreements. You heard them read aloud and trusted the reading was accurate. Disputing written documentation when you couldn't read was nearly impossible. Religious texts were similarly controlled. Priests read sacred texts and explained their meaning, but their interpretations served institutional interests. You accepted what you were told because you couldn't verify it independently. Let's talk about environmental degradation. Deforestation removed what few trees Egypt had. Overgrazing damaged pasture lands. Intensive agriculture depleted soil nutrients. Salt accumulation from poor irrigation reduced field productivity. These weren't sudden catastrophes but gradual declines. As forests disappeared, wood became scarcer and more expensive. Building quality declined. Furniture became luxury items. Fuel shortages forced people to use less efficient alternatives. Soil degradation meant fields produced less over time. You needed to farm more land for the same yield, but land was limited. Productivity declined enough that supporting the population became difficult. Let's talk about loss and grief, inevitable in a high mortality society. Everyone lost children. Most lost multiple children. Parents died while their children were young. Spouses died. Death was constantly present. Grieving had to be functional. You couldn't stop working because someone died. Fields still needed tending. Children still needed care. You grieved while maintaining survival activities. Funerals for common people were simple. The body was wrapped and buried quickly. Elaborate mourning rituals were for the wealthy. Poor people buried their dead and returned to work. Let's talk about hope and aspiration. For most ancient Egyptians, aspirations were modest. Surviving another year, seeing children reach adulthood, having enough food. These weren't grand dreams. They were practical hopes. Upward mobility was rare, but people still imagined better circumstances. Maybe a good harvest would allow purchasing tools. Maybe a child would learn a trade. Maybe a beneficial marriage would improve family circumstances. These possibilities provided motivation. Religious belief offered spiritual hope. The afterlife promised relief from earthly struggles. If you lived properly and received appropriate burial, you might reach the field of reeds. That paradise offered eternal life without hunger or pain. Let's talk about the rhythm of daily life. You woke at dawn because artificial light was limited. You worked through morning before heat became unbearable. You rested during peak afternoon heat if possible. You resumed work in late afternoon. You slept after dark because burning oil for light was expensive. Meals followed work schedules. Simple breakfast. Midday meal during work break. Evening meal after work. Food was fuel for labour, not entertainment. Variety was limited. Social. Interaction happened around work. You talked while grinding grain. You gossiped while fetching water. You discussed problems while repairing irrigation. Dedicated social time was rare. Rest happened when possible, after exhausting work, during festivals, when weather made outdoor work impossible. But rest was interrupted frequently. Years later, decades later if you were lucky, you'd reach the end. Maybe from infection, maybe from injury, maybe from simple exhaustion, as your body finally gave out. You'd be buried simply, mourned briefly, and forgotten within a generation or two. Your children might remember you. Your grandchildren might hear stories. But beyond that, you'd vanish into historical anonymity, one more unnamed life in the great mass of Egyptian existence. That anonymity is perhaps the final indignity, not just that your life was hard, but that it would be completely forgotten. Your struggles meant nothing beyond their immediate context. Your survival benefited no one but yourself and perhaps your family. The civilization continued regardless of whether you specifically lived or died. This is the reality of being ordinary in any ancient civilization, but it's particularly stark in Egypt, where the contrast between monumental permanence and individual transience is so visible. The pyramids remain, the temples stand, the names of pharaohs are remembered, but you'd be dust and sand and silence. Another forgotten life in the endless procession of forgotten lives that made Egypt possible. Seasonal patterns structured the year. Inundation season brought different work than growing season or harvest. Festivals marked transitions and provided temporal landmarks. Years blurred together. Time was measured by agricultural cycles and memorable events. The ultimate question is, could you actually survive in ancient Egypt? The answer depends on circumstance, luck, and timing. If you were born into a stable period, productive region, and avoided fatal hazards, you might survive to middle age. You'd be uncomfortable, frequently hungry, and work constantly. But you might survive. If you were born during unstable periods, in marginal regions, to poor families, you probably wouldn't survive childhood. And even if you did, your life would be short and defined by struggle. Ancient Egypt wasn't survivable in the modern sense. It was endurable. People endured because they had no choice. When ancient Egyptians looked at their existence, they probably didn't think, this is terrible and unfair. They thought, this is life, and we manage it as best we can. Comparison requires alternatives, and most people had no frame of reference for different possibilities. Egypt was Egypt. The Nile flooded or didn't. Crops grew or failed. Children lived or died. These were facts of existence, not injustices requiring reform. The wealthy certainly knew their lives were better than the poor, and they probably justified this through divine order. Pharaohs were gods. Priests served gods. Nobles administered on behalf of gods. The hierarchy was divinely ordained, which made questioning it tantamount to blasphemy. This belief system stabilized society, but also perpetuated inequality across millennia. One version of ancient Egypt emphasizes architectural achievements, artistic sophistication, and cultural longevity. The pyramids stand as testaments to organizational ability and engineering skill. The art speaks to aesthetic sensibility and technical mastery. The civilization lasted 3,000 years, which suggests successful adaptation to challenging environments. Another version emphasizes brutal labor conditions, limited freedoms, high mortality, and social stratification that trapped people in circumstances determined by birth. The monuments were built on worker exhaustion and death. The art served elites who commanded resources while masses struggled. The longevity came at enormous human cost. Both versions are true. Ancient Egypt produced remarkable achievements through systems that were simultaneously sophisticated and oppressive. The civilization succeeded by standards of political continuity and cultural impact while failing by standards of human welfare and equality. Which version you emphasize depends on what you value and whose experiences you center. But here's what's undeniable. You, specifically you, reading this in whatever time you're reading it, would almost certainly not survive ancient Egypt. Not physically, and definitely not psychologically. You're accustomed to safety, medical care, adequate nutrition, clean water, and personal autonomy. You expect to live into your 70s or 80s. You expect childhood to be protected. You expect basic comforts. Ancient Egypt offered none of those expectations. It offered the possibility of survival through constant effort, the certainty of discomfort, and the high probability of premature death. Your modern immune system has no resistance to ancient diseases. Your modern psychology has no preparation for unrelenting labour without hope of improvement. Your modern expectations would collide immediately with ancient realities. Even if you somehow survived physically, you'd be profoundly unhappy. The boredom, the monotony, the lack of privacy, the constant proximity to death. the absence of choice in nearly every aspect of life. These conditions would grind down your mental health until you either adapted completely, becoming someone unrecognizable to your current self, or broke psychologically. An adaptation would mean abandoning nearly everything that defines you as a modern person: your sense of individual rights, your expectation of comfort, your assumption that life can and should improve, your belief in personal agency. All of these would have to go. You'd have to accept that life is struggle, that survival is achievement enough, and that questioning the system serves no purpose, because the system is unchangeable. Some people might manage this transition. Humans are adaptable, but most modern people would fail. We're products of our time, shaped by conditions that bear no resemblance to ancient Egypt. Removing those conditions doesn't just make life harder, it fundamentally changes what life is and what it can be. The Egyptians themselves understood this precariousness. Their art depicts the field of reeds, the afterlife paradise, as Egypt but better. The same landscape, the same activities, just without the hunger, pain, and uncertainty. Even their ideal existence was recognizably Egyptian, suggesting limited imagination of radical alternatives or deep attachment to familiar patterns despite their hardships. This attachment to familiar patterns, even painful ones, is very human. People adapt to circumstances and find meaning within constraints. Ancient Egyptians found joy in festivals, pride in work, love in families, and hope in religious belief. They weren't uniquely miserable. They were humans making the best of difficult circumstances, which humans have done throughout history and continue doing today. But making the best of circumstances doesn't mean the circumstances were good, and survival doesn't mean thriving. Ancient Egyptians survived for millennia, but most individual Egyptians lived short, difficult lives marked more by endurance than enjoyment. That's the reality underneath the monumental architecture and artistic achievements. The monuments remain, the pyramids endure, the temples stand. These physical remnants inspire awe and suggest greatness, but they're monuments to collective effort, not individual welfare. They represent what a society can achieve when it organizes human labor effectively, not what it provides to those humans in return for their labor. Every stone in those monuments was placed by someone who woke up hungry, worked until exhausted, went to sleep in discomfort, and faced uncertain tomorrow. Those individual experiences don't diminish the achievement, but they complicate how we interpret it. Greatness and suffering coexisted. They were inseparable, in fact. The greatness emerged from the suffering, built literally on the backs of people whose names we'll never know and whose individual stories are lost to time. We remember pharaohs, we study dynasties, we catalogue art and architecture, we analyse political structures and religious beliefs. But the farmer who spent 30 years growing wheat and died at 35, the woman who bore 6 children and watched 4 die before age 5, the labourer who moved stones until his spine gave out. These people are statistics, unnamed, unremembered individually, yet they were the majority. They were ancient Egypt, more than any pharaoh or monument. Their lives weren't tragic in the classical sense. Tragedy requires awareness of how things could be different. Most ancient Egyptians probably lacked that awareness. They knew their lives were difficult, but they didn't know those difficulties were preventable through different social organisation. They accepted hardship as inherent to existence, rather than as consequences of choices made by rulers prioritising monuments over welfare. This acceptance was probably psychologically necessary. Constant rage against unchangeable circumstances would be exhausting and pointless. Better to accept, adapt, and find whatever small pleasures and meaning were available. This wasn't resignation born of weakness. It was pragmatic response to reality. You can't change the system when you can barely survive within it. Modern people have luxury of imagining alternatives because we live in circumstances that allow such imagination. We have enough food security to think about food quality. We have enough safety to consider how life could be better, rather than merely how to survive today. This cognitive space for improvement is itself a privilege ancient Egyptians rarely experienced. So when we ask, would you survive ancient Egypt? We're really asking 2 questions. First, would your body survive the physical demands and dangers? Probably not for long. Second, Would your psychological framework survive contact with ancient Egyptian reality? Definitely not without complete transformation. You might survive in the technical sense of continued biological existence, but you, as you currently understand yourself, would not survive. That person would be destroyed by the experience and replaced by someone shaped entirely by ancient Egyptian conditions. Whether that transformed person would still be you in any meaningful sense is a philosophical question without clear answer. What's certain is this: the distance between modern life and ancient Egyptian life is so vast that crossing it would require abandoning nearly everything that defines modern human experience: technology, medicine, education, leisure, choice, privacy, longevity, all gone, replaced by labour, survival, and acceptance of circumstances beyond your control. That's not life as modern people understand it. That's existence. And existence, while better than non-existence, is not the same as living well or even living tolerably by modern standards. It's simply continuing despite everything, day after day, year after year, until eventually you don't continue anymore because something finally kills you. And then you're buried in the desert sand, wrapped in whatever your family could afford, accompanied by whatever possessions you accumulated, and remembered briefly by those who knew you before they too die and are forgotten. Unless you were pharaoh or nobility, in which case you get a tomb, and maybe your name endures for millennia, becoming a museum exhibit for tourists who can't imagine living the life you actually lived. That's ancient Egypt. Monuments and death, achievement and suffering, sophistication and brutality, all true simultaneously, all relevant to understanding what survival really meant in a civilization we admire architecturally, but probably wouldn't want to experience personally, because survival there required giving up nearly everything that makes modern life bearable, and that's a price most modern humans couldn't pay, even if they tried. Ancient Egypt forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress and what constitutes a successful civilization. By metrics of longevity, cultural coherence, and architectural achievement, Egypt succeeded spectacularly. By metrics of individual welfare, personal freedom, and quality of life, it was a brutal system that consumed human lives to produce monuments. Modern civilization isn't exempt from similar critiques. We produce technological wonders while tolerating preventable suffering. We build sophisticated systems that benefit some while exploiting others. The mechanisms differ, but the fundamental tension between collective achievement and individual welfare persists. Maybe we're not as different from ancient Egypt as we'd like to believe. The difference is awareness and possibility. We know life can be organized differently. We know suffering can be reduced through different choices. We have examples of societies that prioritize welfare over monuments. Ancient Egyptians lacked these reference points. Their world was their world, and alternatives were unimaginable. This lack of alternatives shaped everything. Political compliance wasn't primarily fear-based, though fear existed. It was acceptance-based. This is how things are. This is how things have always been. This is how things must be. These beliefs stabilized the system more effectively than force alone could achieve. When the system broke down during intermediate periods, people experienced the alternative: chaos, violence, famine, and uncertainty. These periods probably reinforced acceptance when strong central authority returned. Better predictable oppression than unpredictable chaos. Better known hardships than unknown disasters. This isn't endorsement of authoritarian systems. It's recognition that humans prefer stability even when stability means accepting unfavourable conditions. The pharaonic system provided stability for centuries at a time. Floods came predictably. Taxes were collected systematically. Labour was organised effectively. Trade functioned. This reliability had value even though the system itself was oppressive. People could plan. They could anticipate. They knew what was expected and what they'd receive in return, even if the exchange was unfavourable. Modern systems claim to provide both stability and freedom, welfare and achievement. Whether they succeed is debatable. But the claim itself represents progress. We've moved from accepting oppression as necessary to believing it isn't necessary. That shift in consciousness, even when reality lags behind ideals, represents fundamental change from ancient Egyptian worldview. Ancient Egyptians believed pharaohs were divine because that belief justified the system. Modern people believe individuals have rights because that belief challenges unjust systems. These foundational beliefs shape what's possible socially and politically. Changing beliefs is prerequisite for changing conditions. But belief change requires exposure to alternatives. Ancient Egyptians had limited exposure. They knew other civilizations existed, but those civilizations had similar social structures. Monarchy, hierarchy, and labor exploitation were universal. Imagining radically different systems without examples was nearly impossible. We have examples now. Democracies exist alongside authoritarian states. Welfare systems exist alongside laissez-faire economies. Various social organizations demonstrate different possibilities. This multiplicity of examples expands our ability to imagine and implement alternatives. Ancient Egyptians lacked that multiplicity. Their experience taught them that all human societies have rulers who demand labor and taxes in exchange for organization and protection. This wasn't wrong based on their evidence. It was accurate description of every society they knew. Challenging it would have seemed absurd. So when we judge ancient Egypt by modern standards, we're judging people who couldn't imagine those standards were possible. They weren't choosing oppression over freedom. They were choosing survival within the only system they knew. That's not moral failing. It's human limitation operating within constrained circumstances. The same logic applies to future judgments of our time. Future people may look at our civilization and wonder how we tolerated conditions we consider normal. They'll have evidence that alternatives existed because some societies implemented them. They'll question why we didn't universally adopt better systems when we knew they were possible. And the answer will be similar to why ancient Egyptians didn't overthrow the pharaonic system. Change is difficult. Existing systems resist transformation. People adapt to current conditions rather than risk upheaval. Unless circumstances become intolerable, humans tolerate suboptimal arrangements because familiar bad is often preferable to unfamiliar unknown. Ancient Egypt proves humans can endure remarkable hardship if it's normalized through culture and belief. It also proves that endurance doesn't equal acceptance in the sense of thinking conditions are good. People can simultaneously accept reality and wish reality were different. They just lack mechanism for transforming wishes into change when systems are stable and alternatives seem impossible. The monuments remain as evidence of what humans can achieve when labour is organised effectively towards singular goals. But they're also evidence of what humans will tolerate when alternatives seem unavailable. Every stone represents both human capability and human vulnerability, both our ability to accomplish extraordinary things and our tendency to accept extraordinary costs. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt just because conditions were harsh. You wouldn't survive because you've been shaped by different possibilities. Medical care can prevent deaths. Adequate nutrition is achievable. Childhood can be protected. Labour doesn't have to destroy bodies. These things because you've experienced or witnessed them. Ancient Egyptians didn't know these things were possible because their experience provided no evidence. Your knowledge would make ancient Egyptian life unbearable psychologically even if you somehow survived physically. You'd know things could be different even while trapped in circumstances that weren't different. That knowledge without power to change circumstances would be torture. Ancient Egyptians were spared that particular torture. They endured physical hardship without psychological torment of knowing it was preventable. Maybe that's small mercy, or maybe ignorance of alternatives is simply another form of oppression. Either way, it's the difference between their experience and yours. They didn't know. You do. That knowledge transforms how you'd experience the same conditions. It would make survival require not just physical endurance, but complete psychological break from everything you understand about how human life can and should be organized. And that's impossible for most modern people. Not because we're weak, because we're products of specific historical moment that provided different experiences and knowledge. Remove us from that moment, place us in ancient Egypt, and we'd be as lost as ancient Egyptians would be in modern world. Neither better nor worse, just differently equipped for radically different circumstances. The final truth is this. Ancient Egypt was survivable for ancient Egyptians because they knew nothing else. It would be unsurvivable for you because you know too much. Knowledge can be burden when circumstances can't be changed. And in ancient Egypt, circumstances couldn't be changed by individuals or even communities. They were determined by geography, technology, and social organization that had achieved stable configuration. That stability lasted millennia, but it came at cost measured in individual human lives that were shorter, harder, and more constrained than they needed to be even by ancient standards. That cost was invisible to those paying it because they had no basis for calculating it differently. They paid because payment was required, and surviving required paying. We can see the cost clearly only because we have evidence that different arrangements are possible. They lacked that evidence, so they paid, generation after generation, building monuments that would outlast them all, never knowing that the price could have been lower, or that their lives could have been longer, easier, or more their own. That's ancient Egypt. That's why you wouldn't survive it. And that's why, despite our legitimate admiration for what they achieved, we should be grateful we don't have to try. One last consideration deserves attention. What ancient Egypt teaches us about human nature and civilization. Humans are adaptable to circumstances that modern people would consider intolerable. This adaptability is both strength and vulnerability. Strength because it enables survival in hostile environments. Vulnerability because it enables acceptance of unnecessary suffering when that suffering becomes normalized. Ancient Egyptians adapted to conditions that killed many, harmed most, and benefited few. They did this for 3,000 years, creating cultural achievements we still admire. But adaptation to bad circumstances isn't the same as good circumstances being unnecessary. It's just evidence that humans can survive almost anything if they must. The question isn't whether you could adapt to ancient Egypt if magically transported there with no choice. Humans can adapt to nearly anything. The question is whether you should have to adapt to those conditions when alternatives exist or could be created. The answer is no, and the fact that ancient Egyptians successfully adapted doesn't justify the conditions that required adaptation. We study ancient Egypt to understand human history, not to idealize human conditions. The pyramids are remarkable, but they're remarkable engineering achievements built through social systems we'd reject if we experienced them directly. That's fine. We can appreciate ancient accomplishments while acknowledging the human costs, and being grateful we don't replicate those conditions today. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt, but more importantly, you wouldn't want to survive it, and that distinction matters. Your unwillingness isn't weakness. It's recognition that survival alone isn't sufficient goal when survival requires sacrificing everything that makes life worth living beyond mere biological continuation. Ancient Egyptians did what they had to do. You would be unable to do the same because you've been fortunate enough to live in circumstances where such sacrifice isn't required. That fortune is historical accident, not personal achievement. But it's still fortune worth recognizing and preserving. Because once you've known better, returning to worse becomes not just physically difficult, but psychologically impossible. When historians study ancient Egypt, they focus on what left traces: written records, archaeological remains, monumental architecture. But most of what defined daily existence left no traces. The conversations, the small kindnesses, the private griefs, the moments of joy, the relationships, all gone. History preserves the exceptional and loses the ordinary. This means our understanding of ancient Egypt is fundamentally skewed toward elites and extraordinary circumstances. We know about pharaohs because they built monuments and left inscriptions. We know less about farmers because their lives generated no permanent records. The result is history that's simultaneously accurate in its specifics and misleading in its overall impression. The Egypt of popular imagination is pyramids, gold masks and hieroglyphics. The Egypt of daily reality was mud, grain and labour. Both are true, but they're not equally true. The daily reality affected millions. The monumental achievements affected thousands at best. Yet we remember the achievements and forget the reality because achievements survive and reality decays. This preservation bias affects how we understand all ancient civilizations, but Egypt's monumental architecture makes the bias particularly extreme. The temptation is to see Egypt through its monuments and project that grandeur onto daily life. But monuments and daily life existed in different worlds. The people who built monuments lived in the same harsh conditions as everyone else. They just occasionally saw the results of their labour reaching toward the sky, instead of disappearing into someone's stomach. That reaching toward the sky mattered symbolically. It represented human aspiration to create something lasting, something that transcended individual mortality. The pyramids would outlast their builders. The temples would stand for millennia. In civilizations where individual lives were short and insignificant, creating something permanent had profound psychological value. But symbolic value doesn't feed children. It doesn't prevent disease. It doesn't reduce labor's physical toll. It provides meaning, which humans need. But meaning without material security is cold comfort. Ancient Egyptians got meaning from their civilization's achievements and religious beliefs. They did not get physical security, health, or comfort. These are different needs, and meeting one doesn't substitute for meeting the other. Modern people sometimes romanticize ancient civilizations, imagining simpler times with stronger communities and clearer purposes. This romanticism ignores the material conditions that made those times brutal for most people. Yes, communities were close-knit, because they had to be. Survival required cooperation. Yes, purpose was clear, because survival was the purpose, and achieving it required constant effort. These weren't blessings. They were necessities born from hardship. The communities formed under duress. The shared purpose emerged from shared struggle. Remove the duress and struggle, and the communities and purpose would look different. Possibly better, possibly worse, but definitely not the romanticized versions of modern imagination. Human relationships under survival pressure are complicated. They include both remarkable solidarity and brutal pragmatism. Ancient Egyptians helped each other survive. They also exploited each other when opportunity arose. They formed deep bonds. They also enforced conformity through social pressure. They showed compassion. They also showed cruelty. They were humans in difficult circumstances, displaying full range of human behavior that includes both nobility and selfishness, often from the same individuals at different moments. This complexity gets lost in both romanticized and demonized versions of ancient life. Ancient Egypt wasn't noble simplicity or pure oppression. It was human society operating under constraints that shaped behavior in ways we can analyze but never fully understand, without experiencing those constraints directly. And experiencing them directly would destroy our ability to analyze them objectively, because survival would dominate all other concerns. That's the paradox. We can understand ancient Egypt intellectually only because we don't experience it physically. Physical experience would eliminate intellectual distance. You'd be too busy surviving to contemplate the nature of your survival. Ancient Egyptians probably didn't spend much time philosophizing about their circumstances because they were too busy managing those circumstances. Philosophy requires leisure, and leisure requires security. The few ancient Egyptians who did philosophize were elites with enough security to think rather than merely react. Their philosophies probably didn't reflect common experience. They reflected elite experience, which was different. This means even ancient Egyptian thought about ancient Egypt is unrepresentative. The masses left no philosophical records because they couldn't write and had no time to think systematically about their situation. We're left inferring their experiences from material evidence, which tells us about conditions but not about subjective responses to conditions. We know malnutrition was common. We don't know how it felt to be constantly hungry. We know child mortality was high. We don't know how it felt to bury multiple children. We know labour was exhausting. We don't know how it felt to wake up each day knowing that exhaustion awaited and would continue until death. These experiential gaps matter. They mean our understanding is necessarily incomplete. We can describe what happened. We can't fully grasp what it was like. This limitation should create humility about our interpretations. We're educated guesses, not certainties. The past is foreign country, and we're tourists with guidebooks, not natives with lived experience. That said, some conclusions seem solid. Ancient Egypt was a hard place to live for most people. Survival required constant effort. Death came early and often. Social mobility was minimal. Personal freedom was limited. These aren't interpretations. They're facts supported by extensive evidence. The interpretive questions are about how people experience those facts and whether they could imagine alternatives. Those questions don't have definitive answers, but they matter for understanding whether ancient Egyptians were victims of circumstances or active participants in creating those circumstances. Probably both, in varying degrees at different times. The pharaonic system wasn't imposed entirely from above, it required participation from below. People had to accept their roles and perform their functions. That acceptance was secured through combination of force, ideology, and pragmatic recognition that alternatives seemed worse or impossible. This acceptance wasn't false consciousness exactly. It was rational response to available options. You can't rebel against system when rebellion means death and compliance means survival, even if survival is difficult. You choose survival, not because you're happy about conditions, but because you prefer life to death. That's not moral failing, it's human nature operating under extreme constraints. Modern people live under different constraints that allow different choices. We can question systems without risking death. We can imagine alternatives with some reasonable hope of implementation. We can withhold participation from unjust systems and survive. These options exist because previous generations created material and social conditions that expanded human freedom. Ancient Egyptians lived before those conditions existed, so their options were different and more limited. Judging them for not rebelling is anachronistic. Judging the system that constrained them is legitimate. Systems can be evaluated regardless of historical context. Ancient Egypt's social organization produced remarkable achievements through exploitation that harmed most people who participated. That exploitation wasn't unusual for ancient civilizations, but being typical doesn't make it acceptable. It just means the entire ancient world was organized around principles we now recognize as unjust. Recognizing historical injustice doesn't require judging ancient people by modern standards. It requires acknowledging that human suffering matters regardless of when it occurs, and that systems causing unnecessary suffering deserve criticism, even when alternatives weren't available to people living under those systems. Ancient Egyptians did their best within an unjust system. The system itself remains unjust by any reasonable evaluation of human welfare. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt partly because the system would kill you through physical hardship, but also because the system would violate every modern assumption about human rights, dignity, and freedom. Your body might theoretically adapt. Your values couldn't adapt without ceasing to be your values, and values are more fundamental to identity than physical capabilities. Losing your values would mean losing yourself more completely than losing life would. At least death preserves who you were. Adaptation to ancient Egypt would require becoming someone else entirely. That transformation is possible in theory. Humans throughout history have adapted to circumstances that would horrify their previous selves. But the adaptation is loss, not growth. It's subtraction of possibility, not addition of capability. You'd survive by becoming less, not more. Less free, less comfortable, less healthy, less autonomous, less everything that makes modern life worth living, and less able to imagine that life could be otherwise because imagination requires cognitive space that survival pressure eliminates. Ancient Egyptians didn't imagine radical alternatives because they couldn't afford to waste mental energy on impossibilities. They needed all available energy for survival. That efficiency makes sense from individual perspective, but creates social stagnation. Systems that could be improved don't improve when everyone focuses on immediate survival rather than long-term change. The system persists because nobody has resources to challenge it effectively. This dynamic explains how oppressive systems can last millennia, despite harming most people. The system doesn't need everyone's enthusiastic support. It just needs people to be too busy surviving to organize effective resistance. Ancient Egypt achieved that balance remarkably well. The pharaonic system lasted 3,000 years not because people loved it, but because they couldn't organize alternatives while also managing survival. Modern revolutionary movements succeed, partly because modern conditions provide enough slack in survival requirements that people can dedicate time to political organization. Ancient Egypt had no such slack. Every hour spent organizing resistance was hour not spent on survival activities. Unless you could guarantee resistance would quickly succeed and improve conditions, attempting it was irrational. And guaranteeing quick success was impossible, so rational choice was compliance. This rationality of compliance explains why ancient Egyptians weren't failures for not overthrowing pharaohs. They were realists operating within impossible constraints. The real question isn't why they didn't rebel, but why the system that constrained them so severely was allowed to persist without external challenge. And the answer is that similar systems were universal. There was no external alternative offering dramatically better conditions. Every ancient civilization exploited populations to varying degrees. Egypt wasn't unique, it was typical. That typicality suggests something depressing about ancient human organization. Before modern economic and political developments created viable alternatives, exploitative hierarchy was apparently the only way to organize large-scale societies. Maybe that's too pessimistic. Maybe alternatives were possible but unexplored. But the evidence suggests that all successful ancient civilizations converged on similar structures: rulers, administrators, soldiers, workers, and slaves in hierarchies justified by religion or tradition. Egypt was just one version of universal pattern. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt, but you probably wouldn't survive ancient anywhere for similar reasons. The specifics varied. The fundamental structure was consistent. Humans organized themselves hierarchically, extracted labor from majorities to benefit minorities, and justified this organization through ideologies that made alternatives unthinkable. That was ancient world. We live in different world not because we're better people, but because historical processes created material conditions allowing different organization. Be grateful for historical accident, not proud of moral superiority. Given ancient conditions, we'd probably create ancient systems. Given modern conditions, ancient people might create modern systems. Circumstances shape possibilities more than character shapes choices. Understanding this connection between circumstances and organization helps explain why ancient Egypt fascinates modern people. We see what humans achieved with limited technology and recognize the capability. We also see the costs and feel grateful we don't pay them. That combination of admiration and relief defines our relationship with all ancient civilizations. We visit ruins as tourists, not as time travelers hoping to stay. We study pyramids in books, not from scaffolding while moving stones. We appreciate ancient achievements from safe distance of several thousand years and modern comforts. This distance allows perspective impossible for ancient Egyptians. They lived inside their system and couldn't see it objectively. We live outside and can analyze structure, function, and consequences. But our analysis misses experiential reality they knew intimately. Neither perspective is complete. Combined, they provide fuller understanding than either alone. But combining them requires acknowledging limitations of both. Your modern perspective would make ancient Egypt unbearable, because you'd see alternatives that ancient Egyptians couldn't see. Their perspective made ancient Egypt manageable, because they accepted conditions you'd reject. Neither perspective is wrong. They're products of different information and experiences. Place you in their circumstances without their mindset, and you'd suffer more than they did. Give them your mindset in their circumstances, and they'd suffer more than they actually did. Ignorance of alternatives, while limiting in some ways, was protective in others. This suggests disturbing conclusion. Happiness might correlate inversely with knowledge of better possibilities. The more you know about how things could be better, the more you suffer from how things actually are. Ancient Egyptians were spared some psychological suffering through ignorance of alternatives. Modern people suffer more from inequality and injustice, partly because we know they're preventable. Neither state is obviously preferable. Ignorant contentment versus knowledgeable discontent. Different forms of human experience, each with advantages and costs. Ancient Egypt maximized the first. We increasingly choose the second. Which produces more total human welfare is genuinely unclear. Material conditions are objectively better now. Subjective satisfaction might not be proportionally better, because rising expectations keep satisfaction relatively constant. This is speculation. We can't measure historical happiness with any reliability. But the question matters for understanding what progress means, and whether material improvements necessarily produce proportional experiential improvements. Maybe ancient Egyptians were as satisfied with their lives as we are with ours, despite vastly different material conditions. Maybe satisfaction is relative to expectations, and expectations are culturally determined, so cross-cultural comparisons are meaningless. Or maybe suffering is objective, and ancient Egyptians objectively suffered more, full stop. These philosophical questions don't have empirical answers. They frame how we think about history, but can't be resolved through historical evidence. What's clear is that you specifically, with your specific psychology and expectations would not be satisfied in ancient Egypt. Your dissatisfaction would stem not just from material conditions but from knowledge that better conditions are possible. That knowledge would be torture in circumstances where you couldn't actualize better possibilities. Ancient Egyptians lacked that particular torture. Whether that made them fortunate or unfortunate depends on whether ignorance or knowledge produces more human flourishing. Philosophers have debated this for millennia without resolution. Ancient Egypt won't resolve the debate either, but it illustrates the stakes. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years and produced remarkable achievements also consumed millions of human lives in difficult circumstances. Those lives couldn't escape or improve. That's simultaneously success and failure, achievement and tragedy, impressive and horrifying. How you weight those competing judgments reveals your values more than it reveals objective truth about ancient Egypt. The facts support multiple interpretations. Which interpretation you choose depends on what you think matters most: collective achievements or individual welfare, cultural longevity or personal flourishing, monumental legacy or lived experience. You probably weight toward individual welfare, personal flourishing, and lived experience because you're a modern person, shaped by modern values. Ancient Egyptians probably weighted toward collective achievements, cultural continuity, and divine order because they were ancient people shaped by ancient values. Neither weighting is objectively correct. They're value judgments disguised as factual claims. Recognizing them as value judgments doesn't make them invalid. It just makes them honest about what they are. Choices about what matters, not discoveries about what is. Your choice to value individual welfare over monumental achievement is valid. It's also relatively recent in human history. Most ancient civilizations would have found it incomprehensible or even immoral. They believed collective good transcended individual comfort, that great works justified personal sacrifice, that cultural achievement redeemed individual suffering. These beliefs seem alien now. They were universal then. Progress in values, if it exists, comes from expanding circle of moral consideration and questioning justifications for suffering. Ancient Egypt did neither. It was morally typical for its time, which is damning by modern standards but not by ancient ones. This temporal relativity of moral standards creates problems for historical judgment. Do we judge ancient civilizations by their standards or ours? By their standards, Egypt was successful, pious, and well organized. By our standards, it was exploitative, oppressive, and cruel. Both judgments are valid from their respective frameworks. Choosing framework is itself value judgment that predetermines conclusion. There's no neutral ground from which to judge. There's only honesty about the ground you're standing on when you judge. You're standing on modern ground, shaped by modern values, equipped with modern knowledge. From that ground, ancient Egypt looks difficult to survive, not just physically, but philosophically. The physical challenge is obvious. The philosophical challenge is deeper. You'd have to accept values contradicting everything you believe about human rights, dignity, and freedom. That acceptance would require either complete transformation of your identity or constant cognitive dissonance between your values and your circumstances. Neither option is appealing. Both would make survival feel like failure even if you achieved it technically. That's why the question, would you survive ancient Egypt, has no simple answer. Survive physically? Probably not. But maybe. Survive psychologically? Definitely not without becoming someone else. Survive in any sense that preserves your identity and values? Impossible. The ancient Egyptian environment was hostile to modern psychology in ways more profound than physical dangers. It challenged fundamental assumptions about human existence that modern people take for granted, but that ancient people couldn't imagine. Those assumptions include ideas like individual autonomy, personal choice, equality before law, protection from arbitrary power, opportunity for advancement, and right to pursue happiness. None of these existed in ancient Egypt. They would have seemed absurd if proposed. Society existed to maintain order and please gods. Individuals existed to serve society. Personal happiness was irrelevant unless it contributed to social function and religious duty. These priorities inverted modern assumptions completely. Living under inverted assumptions would drive modern person insane or require abandoning modern identity. Either outcome represents failure to survive in meaningful sense. Physical survival without psychological continuity isn't survival of you. It's survival of body that once belonged to you, but now belongs to person shaped entirely by ancient Egyptian values and experiences. That person wouldn't be you anymore. They'd be ancient Egyptian who happens to have your genetics. And they probably wouldn't be happy about the transformation even if they accepted it as necessary. This transformation would happen gradually through accumulation of experiences that contradict modern assumptions. Each contradiction would force choice between maintaining assumptions and adapting to reality. Initially, you'd maintain assumptions and suffer cognitive dissonance. Eventually, if you survived, you'd adapt assumptions to reality because cognitive dissonance is unsustainable long-term. That adaptation would feel like loss, even as it enabled survival. You'd mourn your former self while accepting transformation as necessary. That mourning would mark the death of who you were and birth of who circumstances forced you to become. Ancient Egyptians didn't experience this transformation because they were born into circumstances that shaped them from beginning. They never had modern assumptions to lose. Their identity was always Egyptian, always adapted to Egyptian circumstances, always consistent with Egyptian values. That consistency made their lives difficult but not schizophrenic. They knew who they were and what was expected. They suffered from circumstances, not from contradictions between values and circumstances. That's a different form of suffering, and possibly more tolerable. You would suffer both forms. Circumstances would be difficult, contradictions would be torture, combined suffering would be unbearable. That's final answer to whether you'd survive ancient Egypt. No, not in any meaningful sense. Your body might persist briefly. Your identity wouldn't persist at all. And survival without identity preservation isn't survival of you. It's slow death with heartbeat. Better to acknowledge that honestly than pretend you could endure through force of will. Will doesn't overcome structural impossibility. Ancient Egypt was structurally impossible for modern psychology. That impossibility is fact, not weakness. Recognizing it is wisdom, not surrender. So when we ask whether you'd survive ancient Egypt, we're really asking whether modern human can exist in ancient circumstances. The answer is no. Modern humans are products of modernity. Remove modernity, and you remove conditions that make modern humans possible. What remains might be human in biological sense. It wouldn't be modern in psychological sense. That difference is everything. It's the distance between worlds separated by millennia of historical development. We can study that distance intellectually. We can't cross it personally without ceasing to be ourselves. And that cessation, that loss of self, is death by another name. Maybe slower, maybe less recognized, but death nonetheless. The death of who you were and could have remained if circumstances had been different. Ancient Egypt would kill you that way even if it didn't kill you quickly through disease, injury, or starvation. The killing would be complete and irrevocable, and that's why the honest answer is no. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt, not as yourself, not in any sense that matters to who you are now. You'd die there, one way or another, because the distance between your world and theirs cannot be bridged without destroying yourself in the attempt. Consider for a moment what would actually happen if you were transported to ancient Egypt tomorrow. Not gradually acclimated, not given time to adjust, just suddenly present in the Nile Valley around 2000 BCE, with your modern body, modern psychology, and modern expectations. The first day would be shock. The heat, the smell, the insects, the dirt. You'd be overwhelmed immediately by sensory input that ancient Egyptians had learned to filter, but that would assault you constantly. You wouldn't know the language. Ancient Egyptian in any of its forms, old, middle, late, is dead language requiring years of study to comprehend even with modern educational tools. You'd be functionally mute, unable to communicate beyond gestures. This isolation would be immediate and profound. Every interaction would be struggle. Every need would require pantomime. You'd be child in adult body, completely dependent on others' patience and goodwill for survival. Assuming someone took pity on you and didn't simply kill you as dangerous foreigner or enslave you as vulnerable stranger, you'd need to learn survival skills you've never practiced. Grinding grain, making fire without matches, working with tools you've never used, navigation without GPS or maps, time telling without clocks. These aren't recreational skills you can learn casually on weekends. They're essential capabilities whose absence means death. You'd have steep learning curve with no safety net while your body was simultaneously dealing with malnutrition, parasites, and diseases for which you have no immunity. The diseases alone would probably kill you quickly. Your immune system is adapted to modern environment with antibiotics, vaccines, and public health infrastructure. Ancient Egyptian disease environment would overwhelm it rapidly. You'd catch something: dysentery, typhoid, parasites, infections. And without modern medicine, you'd likely die. Even if the disease wasn't immediately fatal, it would weaken you enough that you couldn't work, and if you couldn't work, you couldn't eat, and then you'd die anyway from a combination of disease and starvation. But let's say you somehow survived those first weeks. You learned enough language to communicate, basically. You found people willing to help you. You avoided fatal diseases through luck. You adapted physically enough to function minimally. Now you face the psychological challenge of daily existence, in circumstances completely foreign to everything you've experienced. You wake up in pain because sleeping on reed mat destroyed your back. You're hungry because yesterday's rations were inadequate. You're thirsty, but the water you have access to is unsafe by modern standards. You need to urinate, but there's no private bathroom, just communal area you share with dozens of others. You want to shower, but that means going to a river where crocodiles might be present. And anyway, the water will get you wet but not clean because soap doesn't exist. You start your day not with coffee and breakfast, but with chunk of bread so coarse it hurts to chew and cup of thick beer that barely counts as alcoholic. Then you go to work. Not office work. Not even skilled trade if you just arrived. Basic labour. Moving dirt, carrying stones, pulling ropes, whatever the overseer assigns. You work through morning in heat that reaches 100 plus degrees. Your hands blister, your back aches, your muscles scream. But you continue because stopping means losing your ration allocation. Around midday you get brief rest and small meal. More bread. Some onions if you're lucky. You sit in whatever shade you can find and try to recover enough energy for afternoon work. Conversations happen around you in language you barely understand. You're isolated, even surrounded by people. Lunchtime ends and work resumes. More labour, more heat, more exhaustion. This continues until evening when light fails and work becomes impossible. You return to wherever you're staying, probably communal dwelling shared with strangers who barely tolerate your presence. You get evening meal, bread, beer, maybe some fish or vegetables if it's been a good day. You're still hungry after eating everything available. You'll go to sleep hungry and wake up hungry. This is normal. This is every day. You talk briefly with people you're starting to know. The conversations are shallow because language barrier persists and because everyone's too exhausted for deep discussion. Besides, what would you discuss? The Nile flooded or didn't? Crops grow or don't? People live or die? What else is there? As evening darkens, you prepare to sleep on your reed mat with thin blanket. The temperature drops, but not enough to be comfortable. You're either too hot or too cold. Insects bite you. Your body hurts everywhere from day's labour. You think about tomorrow, which will be exactly like today, and the day after, and the day after that, forever, until you die, or circumstances change, and circumstances won't change, because you're nobody with no resources or status or prospects for acquiring either. That's when the psychological weight would hit you. This is your life now, not temporarily, not for defined period, indefinitely. Until you die, which might be next week from disease or injury, might be next year from accident or violence, might be in 20 years from accumulated damage to body that can't heal properly without modern medicine. Whenever death comes, it will come to person who lived entire adult life in grinding poverty, doing manual labour for subsistence rations, while having no control over circumstances and no hope of improvement. Modern people are not psychologically equipped for this. We expect progress. We believe effort leads to advancement. We assume we have agency in our lives. Ancient Egypt would demolish all these assumptions. Your efforts wouldn't lead to advancement. They'd lead to tomorrow being like today. Your agency wouldn't determine your circumstances. External forces completely beyond your control, Nile flood levels, Pharaoh's policies, local administrators' whims, would determine everything. Your expectations of progress would collide with reality of stagnation. That collision would create existential crisis modern people cannot resolve without either breaking psychologically or transforming completely. Breaking means depression, despair, loss of will to continue. Many people throughout history have broken under lesser pressure. Transforming means abandoning modern identity and accepting ancient Egyptian worldview. Life is suffering. Suffering is inevitable. Endurance is virtue. And questioning circumstances is pointless. That transformation requires losing yourself so completely that you become a different person. Not better or worse, just different. Unrecognizably different. Neither option is surviving in meaningful sense. Breaking means death, immediate or gradual. Transforming means death of your identity, which is slower but equally final. The person you were wouldn't exist anymore. New person inhabiting your body would exist, but they'd be so changed by circumstances that calling them you would be technically accurate but meaningfully false. They'd have your genetics but not your psychology, your memories but not your values, your history but not your future. They'd be ancient Egyptians shaped by ancient Egyptian life, and that person would be stranger to your current self. This strangeness is what makes survival impossible. You can't survive by becoming someone else. That's not survival, that's replacement. Your body persists, but you don't. And if you don't persist, you didn't survive, regardless of whether your body continues functioning. Identity is more essential to survival than biological processes. We recognize this in cases of severe brain damage where a person's body survives but they're effectively gone. Ancient Egypt would cause similar loss through environmental pressure rather than physical injury. The result would be the same. Someone who was you no longer is, even though body remains. Now consider the reverse scenario. Ancient Egyptian transported to modern times would face similar challenges but different details. They'd be shocked by technology, overwhelmed by options, confused by social complexity. But they'd also have access to medicine that could treat their parasites and infections. They'd have access to food that wouldn't destroy their teeth. They'd have access to information that could help them understand new environment. They'd have legal protections preventing others from simply enslaving or killing them. Their survival odds would be better despite being equally disoriented. This asymmetry matters. Ancient person in modern environment has access to resources that can help them survive and adapt. Modern person in ancient environment has no such resources. You'd be on your own with no safety net, no support systems, no infrastructure to cushion your ignorance and vulnerability. That fundamental difference explains why ancient person might theoretically adapt to modernity, but modern person almost certainly can't adapt to antiquity. The environments are asymmetrically hostile. Modernity, for all its stresses and complications, provides resources that enable survival, even for people profoundly displaced from their origin circumstances. Antiquity provided no such resources. You survived through community support, which required being accepted by community, which required being useful to community, which required skills you don't have and couldn't quickly learn. Without that chain of requirements being met, you'd be expendable person in an environment where human life was already cheap. Your death would be unremarkable and unmourned except perhaps by the few people who briefly knew you before you died. That's the stark reality underlying the question. Ancient Egypt didn't have surplus resources or infrastructure to support people who couldn't immediately contribute. Modern countries have safety nets, however inadequate, that prevent outright starvation for most displaced persons. Ancient Egypt had no such nets. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. If you didn't eat, you died. Simple arithmetic of survival in a resource-constrained environment with no conception of welfare systems or social safety nets. Your modern expectations of basic support during crisis would collide with ancient reality of complete absence of support. This collision would be educational in most brutal way possible. You'd learn very quickly that survival is individual responsibility, not collective guarantee. You'd learn that hunger doesn't care about fairness or desert or extenuating circumstances. You'd learn that death is always close and often sudden and rarely dignified. These lessons would come fast and hard, without opportunity for gradual adjustment or preparation. The modern world insulates us from these lessons. We learn them intellectually through history and anthropology, but we don't experience them viscerally. That insulation makes us soft in ways that ancient people couldn't afford to be soft. This isn't moral judgment. It's simply observation that different environments demand different psychological adaptations, and modern environment allows softness that ancient environment would punish fatally. You're soft by ancient standards, not weak, just soft. You expect comfort, you assume safety, you require privacy, you need variety, you demand autonomy. None of these are character flaws, they're reasonable expectations in modern context. But in ancient Egyptian context, they'd all be lethal liabilities. Each expectation unmet would cause psychological damage. Accumulated damage would eventually break you or force transformation that eliminates expectations along with everything else that made you modern person. This is what survival in ancient Egypt actually means. Not adventure, not challenge, not growth. Just grinding destruction of modern identity and its replacement with something that could endure ancient Egyptian reality. That replacement might enable physical survival, but it wouldn't be you surviving. It would be ancient Egyptian who used to be you, and that person would look back at their former self with incomprehension, or contempt or pity, unable to understand how anyone could live with such soft expectations and weak adaptations. You wouldn't want to become that person even if you could. That person would judge your current values as childish and your current lifestyle as decadent. They wouldn't be wrong from their perspective. From your perspective, they'd have lost everything worth preserving. Both perspectives would be valid. Both would be tragic. The transformation would be loss regardless of whether it enabled survival. You'd survive by ceasing to be you. That's not triumph. That's defeat disguised as adaptation. So the final answer remains no. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. Not because you're weak or unprepared, though you're both by ancient standards, because survival would require destroying yourself, and destruction isn't survival even when it enables continued biological existence. Ancient Egypt would force that choice upon you. Be destroyed or die. You'd probably choose death, whether actively or passively, because death preserves who you were even as it ends what you are. Transformation would end both, replacing you with someone shaped entirely by circumstances you'd find intolerable. That replacement would continue existing in your body, but you would be as gone as if you'd died. And that's why, fundamentally and finally, you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. The person who might survive wouldn't be you anymore. And if you don't survive, survival of your body becomes a relevant distinction without meaningful difference from death itself. The tragedy of this situation is that ancient Egyptians themselves, could they see your world, would probably think you're the one who wouldn't survive. They'd look at your soft hands, your poor physical conditioning, your complete ignorance of practical survival skills, and conclude you're helpless child in adult body. They wouldn't be entirely wrong. Each of you is adapted to your respective environment and helpless outside it. The difference is that your environment has resources that might help ancient person adapt. Their environment has no such resources for modern person. This reveals something important about progress. It's not that modern humans are better than ancient humans in any essential way. It's that modern circumstances are better, and those circumstances shape what's possible for humans living within them. Remove those circumstances and modern humans lose all advantages. We're not superior, we're fortunate. Fortune can be lost. Superiority, if it existed, would be inherent. Nothing about us is inherently better equipped for general survival than ancient Egyptians. We're specifically adapted to modern environment, which makes us generally maladapted to ancient ones. This specificity of adaptation explains why time travel stories are mostly fantasy. They imagine modern person thriving in past through application of modern knowledge. But knowledge without context is useless. Knowing how diseases spread doesn't help when you can't sterilize equipment or create antibiotics. Understanding metallurgy doesn't help when you lack tools and materials. Modern knowledge is product of modern infrastructure. Remove infrastructure and knowledge becomes trivia, interesting but inapplicable. You couldn't modernize ancient Egypt even with full modern knowledge. You'd lack resources to implement that knowledge. You'd lack power to convince others to try implementations. You'd lack time to develop infrastructure necessary for modern technology. And you'd probably die from disease or hunger before accomplishing anything. The fantasy of changing past through imported knowledge ignores the reality that knowledge requires infrastructure and authority, to become effective action. You'd have neither in ancient Egypt. So your modern knowledge, far from being advantage, would make survival worse. You'd know what's possible, but be unable to achieve it. You'd understand why you're suffering, but be unable to prevent suffering. You'd see solutions, but lack means to implement them. This combination of knowledge and impotence would be psychological torture worse than simple ignorance. Ancient Egyptians were spared this particular torture. They didn't know things could be better, so they didn't suffer from knowing improvements were possible but unachievable. Your knowledge would only add to your burden. Every moment of discomfort would be worse because you'd know it's preventable. Every death you witnessed would be more tragic because you'd understand it's unnecessary. Every hardship would be more frustrating because you'd see how it could be avoided with resources you don't have access to. This amplification of suffering through knowledge would break you faster than physical hardship alone would. Ancient Egyptians had at least one advantage you'd lack. They believed their suffering had meaning. Religious framework explained hardship as divine will, temporary earthly trial before eternal reward, necessary purification, or karmic justice. These explanations might have been false, but they provided psychological comfort. They made suffering bearable by giving it purpose beyond immediate pain. You'd lack these explanations. You'd know suffering is neither necessary nor meaningful. It's just consequence of inadequate social organization and primitive technology. That knowledge strips away comforting stories while providing no alternative comfort. Without religious framework or modern comforts, you'd face bare suffering with no mitigation, pure hardship without purpose or relief. This is perhaps most unbearable human condition, knowing you suffer for no reason, and that suffering will continue indefinitely until death. Ancient Egyptians rarely experienced this particular despair because their worldview provided meaning. You'd experience it constantly because your worldview would collide with reality that contradicts it. This collision between modern worldview and ancient reality is ultimately why survival is impossible. Not just physically difficult, but philosophically impossible. Your understanding of how world should work is fundamentally incompatible with how ancient Egyptian world actually worked. That incompatibility can't be resolved through adaptation or effort. It requires either abandoning your worldview entirely, which means abandoning yourself, or maintaining your worldview while experiencing constant contradiction, which leads to psychological breakdown. Neither option produces survival in meaningful sense. Both produce death of who you currently are. The only question is whether that death happens quickly through breakdown or slowly through transformation. Either way, you don't survive. Your body might persist, but you're gone, and that absence is what we really mean when we say you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. Not that your body would necessarily die, though it probably would, but that you specifically, with your specific identity and values and expectations, would certainly cease to exist. And if you cease to exist, your survival is irrelevant. Something continues, but that something isn't you anymore. This is the deepest answer to the question. Ancient Egypt wasn't just physically dangerous environment that might kill you. It was existentially incompatible environment that would definitely kill you as recognizable self, even if it permitted continued biological existence. That existential incompatibility is what makes time travel to ancient Egypt impossible in practice, even if it were possible in theory. You couldn't go there and remain yourself. You'd go there and become someone else or cease to function. Neither outcome is survival from your current perspective. Both are forms of death that leave bodies still breathing but persons already gone. Understanding this helps explain why ancient Egypt fascinates but doesn't attract as actual destination. We want to observe ancient Egypt, not experience it. We want to learn about ancient Egyptians, not become them. This distinction between observation and participation is crucial. Observation maintains safe distance that preserves our identity. Participation would require abandoning distance along with identity. We wisely choose observation, not because we're cowards, but because we're intelligent enough to recognize that some experiences destroy those who experience them. Ancient Egyptian daily life is one such experience for modern people. It would destroy us, not might destroy, would destroy, certainly and completely, and recognizing that certainty is wisdom rather than weakness. So we arrive at the end of this examination, having explored every dimension of why you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. The physical dangers that would kill your body, the diseases that would overwhelm your immune system, the labor that would break your strength, the malnutrition that would sap your health, the social structures that would crush your autonomy, the psychological incompatibilities that would destroy your identity. All of these were real, constant, and unavoidable for ancient Egyptians. All of them would affect you more severely because you lack their adaptations. But beyond cataloguing dangers and explaining failures, this exploration reveals something deeper about human experience across time. We are profoundly shaped by our circumstances, not just materially but existentially. The environment we inhabit doesn't just provide resources or create constraints, it defines what's possible for us to be and become. Modern environment enables modern humans. Ancient environment enabled ancient humans. Neither environment enables both simultaneously. This means that asking whether you'd survive ancient Egypt is really asking whether modern humans can exist outside modernity. The answer is no. Not because modern humans are inherently weak, but because modern human describes particular configuration of capabilities, expectations, and identity that modernity makes possible. Remove modernity, and that configuration can't be maintained. Something else emerges, maybe capable of surviving. Definitely not modern anymore. Definitely not you anymore. This transformation from modern to ancient human isn't development or growth. It's fundamental reconfiguration that destroys one identity while creating another. The process isn't voluntary self-improvement. It's forced adaptation under extreme pressure. The result isn't better person, it's different person. Comparing them involves category error like comparing child to adult. They're related through continuity but fundamentally different in composition. Ancient Egyptian, who emerged from transforming you, would barely recognize their origins. They'd remember being you the way you remember being child, with mixture of bemusement and incomprehension. How did I think like that? Why did I care about such trivialities? What was I so afraid of? These questions wouldn't be rhetorical. They'd be genuine inability to understand prior self because transformation changed not just behavior, but fundamental consciousness. What mattered to you wouldn't matter to them. What you feared would seem laughable. What you valued would seem incomprehensible. This alienation from former self is hallmark of successful adaptation to radically different circumstances. It proves adaptation happened, but also proves continuity was severed. You're still biologically continuous with that ancient Egyptian. You're not psychologically continuous with them. The psychological break is what makes it death rather than survival. Bodies persist across many changes. Identities don't. When identity changes fundamentally, the person dies even as the body continues. We call this survival only because linguistic convention ties personhood to bodies rather than identities. Philosophically, it's death. Ancient Egyptians presumably experienced less radical transformations during their lives because their environment was relatively stable. You were always Egyptian. You'd always been Egyptian. You'd always be Egyptian. This continuity provided identity stability that modern people lack, but that made ancient life more bearable despite its hardships. You knew who you were. You knew what was expected. You knew your place. These knowledge provided security that compensated partially for material insecurity. Modern people trade that identity stability for material security and gain personal freedom. We can become different people through choices and opportunities. We're not locked into identities determined by birth. This freedom is valuable but destabilizing. We face identity questions ancient Egyptians never confronted because their answers were predetermined. Who am I? What should I do? What matters? Ancient Egyptians had cultural answers. Modern people must find individual answers. This creates anxiety but also possibility. Placing modern person in ancient circumstances combines worst of both worlds. You'd have neither material security nor identity freedom. You'd face ancient material insecurity without ancient identity certainty. You'd have modern consciousness without modern opportunities. You'd be trapped in a situation that maximizes suffering by denying both traditional stability and modern liberty. This combination would be uniquely unbearable because it lacks compensating factors that made either ancient or modern life tolerable in their respective contexts. This is why comparisons between ancient and modern life often miss the point. It's not that one is better than the other in absolute sense. They're different systems with different trade-offs. Ancient life had its compensations for modern people to envy. primarily community cohesion and identity certainty. Modern life has compensations ancient people would envy, primarily material security and personal freedom. Neither system provides everything. Both work for people adapted to them. Neither works for people adapted to the other. You're adapted to modern system. Your adaptation is so thorough you don't even notice it. You take for granted things that ancient Egyptians couldn't imagine, and that your existence depends on absolutely. Clean water from taps, food from stores, medicine from pharmacies, information from internet. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities for modern human survival. Remove them, and modern humans die or transform into something non-modern. That transformation is what we've been discussing for thousands of words. The death of modern identity and its replacement with ancient adaptation. Understanding this helps contextualize broader questions about progress, development, and human nature. We're not essentially different from ancient Egyptians. We're circumstantially different. Given their circumstances, we'd become like them. Given our circumstances, they'd become like us. Human nature is remarkably plastic. That plasticity enables survival across various conditions, but also means we're products of conditions rather than autonomous entities that transcend conditioning. This plasticity should humble us. We're not superior to ancient Egyptians. We're lucky to live when and where we do. That luck is distributed unequally even within modern world. Some people live in conditions approaching ancient hardship. They adapt much as ancient people adapted. Their adaptations don't make them different species. They make them humans responding to different circumstances. The fact that such circumstances persist despite modern capacity to eliminate them should trouble us more than it does. But that's different discussion. For this discussion, the point is that ancient Egypt represents circumstances so different from modern circumstances that crossing between them in either direction would destroy identity adapted to origin point. Ancient person might physically survive modernity, but would be transformed. Modern person probably wouldn't physically survive antiquity, and certainly wouldn't survive psychologically. This asymmetry reflects material differences between environments, not essential differences between peoples. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt for same reasons ancient Egyptian wouldn't survive Mars colony. Wrong adaptations for environment, wrong expectations for reality, wrong preparation for demands. The specifics differ, but the pattern matches. Humans are environment-specific creatures. We thrive in environments we're adapted to. We die or transform in environments we're not adapted to. Ancient Egypt is environment you're not adapted to and can't adapt to without ceasing to be yourself. That's final answer. Not complicated, just comprehensive. Everything we've examined across these many words comes back to this central truth. You and ancient Egypt are incompatible, not because you're weak or they were strong, because you're adapted to different realities that don't permit easy transition. Your reality has antibiotics, sanitation, and human rights. Their reality had parasites, filth, and divine pharaohs. These realities don't reconcile. Living in one while being adapted to other produces death in various forms. Death of body through disease or malnutrition. Death of identity through forced transformation. Death of spirit through impossible contradiction between what you know should be possible and what actually is possible. All deaths, all inevitable, all consequences of fundamental incompatibility. Ancient Egypt teaches us this lesson if we're willing to learn it. Human experience is contextual, not universal. What works in one context fails in others. What seems natural in one setting seems impossible in others. What sustains life under certain conditions destroys it under different conditions. These aren't minor variations on universal human experience. They're fundamentally different modes of existence that share biological continuity, but not experiential continuity. Modern people struggle to grasp this because our context encourages universalist thinking. We believe human rights are universal. We believe human dignity is inherent. We believe human life has intrinsic value, independent of productivity or status. These beliefs are products of modern circumstances that permit their articulation and enforcement. Ancient circumstances didn't permit them. Ancient people weren't less moral for not believing them. They were realistic about what their circumstances allowed. Your universalist beliefs would make ancient Egypt unbearable. because you'd see violations of universal principles everywhere constantly. Slavery, child labour, gender inequality, religious oppression, systematic exploitation. These wouldn't be moral ambiguities requiring navigation. They'd be clear evils demanding opposition. But you couldn't oppose them. You'd lack power, status, and support. You'd witness evil and be powerless to stop it. This powerlessness might be worst torture of all for modern person, convinced that injustice can and should be opposed. Ancient Egyptians presumably felt less tortured by injustices they witnessed, because they didn't conceptualize them as injustices. Social hierarchy was natural order. Gender roles were divine ordinance. Child labour was family necessity. Religious authority was eternal truth. These weren't controversial positions requiring defence. They were obvious facts about reality. Questioning them would have seemed as absurd as questioning whether sky is up or water is wet. Your modern consciousness can't accept these propositions. You know they're not natural or divine or necessary. You know they're social constructions that serve some people's interests while harming others. You know they can be challenged and changed. This knowledge makes you incapable of accepting ancient Egyptian social order. You'd either fight it, which would get you killed, or accept it, which would destroy your identity. No third option exists. No middle ground where you maintain modern consciousness while accommodating ancient reality. The two are mutually exclusive. This mutual exclusivity is why time travel to ancient Egypt would be catastrophic for any modern person attempting it. Not adventure, not learning experience, catastrophe. Death or transformation, with transformation being death by another name. The person who adapted to ancient Egypt wouldn't be you. They'd be someone who used to be you before circumstances forced change so radical that continuity broke. That broken continuity is what we mourn when we contemplate ancient hardships. Not just that people suffered, but that their suffering was accepted as necessary and inevitable. That acceptance was adaptive response enabling survival, but it required consciousness very different from modern consciousness that rejects such acceptance as moral failure. Neither consciousness is objectively correct. They're differently adapted to different realities. Ancient consciousness worked for ancient reality. Modern consciousness works for modern reality. Neither works for the other's reality. Attempting to maintain modern consciousness in ancient reality produces cognitive dissonance that destroys function. Attempting to maintain ancient consciousness in modern reality produces social dysfunction that prevents thriving. Each consciousness is context-specific. Remove context and consciousness becomes maladaptive. You have modern consciousness. Ancient Egypt had ancient context. The mismatch would be absolute and unbridgeable. You wouldn't survive because modern consciousness can't function in ancient context without either breaking or transforming beyond recognition. Either outcome is death of who you currently are. The body might persist, the person doesn't. And we call the result by your name only through linguistic habit that conflates biological continuity with personal continuity. They're not the same thing. Ancient Egypt would prove this by destroying personal continuity while potentially maintaining biological continuity. The body that survived, if anybody survived, wouldn't contain you anymore. It would contain ancient Egyptian, and that ancient Egyptian would be stranger to your current self. So we end where we began, with the question of whether you'd survive ancient Egypt. The answer is no. Not maybe, not depends. No. Absolutely, certainly, completely no. You wouldn't survive in any sense that matters to who you are now. Your body might survive briefly before diseases you have no immunity to killed it. Your identity wouldn't survive even that long. First contact with ancient Egyptian reality would begin destroying modern consciousness, and that destruction would accelerate until either you broke psychologically or transformed fundamentally. Either way, you die. The death might be slow, it might be disguised as adaptation, but it's death nonetheless. Death of who you are and replacement with who circumstances force you to become. And that replacement, that loss of self, is ultimate reason why you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. Because survival requires maintaining continuity, and ancient Egyptian circumstances don't permit maintaining modern continuity. They permit only transformation that eliminates what made you modern. That transformation might enable biological persistence, but it wouldn't enable your survival. It would enable replacement, And replacement isn't survival, it's death with extra steps. That's the final answer. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt because ancient Egypt is incompatible with your existence as modern person. The incompatibility is absolute. The death it causes is certain. And the only uncertainty is whether death comes through body failing or identity transforming. Both are death. Both are inevitable. Both are consequences of fundamental mismatch between who you are and where you'd be. Ancient Egypt was survivable for ancient Egyptians because they belonged there. You don't belong there. You belong in modernity, shaped by modernity, dependent on modernity. Remove modernity, and you die because you're a fundamentally modern creature who can't exist outside modern context. That's not weakness. That's specificity. And that specificity explains completely and finally why you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. You're the wrong kind of human for that time and place. And being wrong kind means you don't survive. You just die or transform into the right kind, which is different death wearing different name. Either way, you don't survive. You just end. And that ending is certain if you ever found yourself in ancient Egypt, which thankfully you won't, because ancient Egypt is safely dead and buried under 3,000 years of sand and history. And that's where it should stay. In the past, examined from safe distance, never experienced directly, always remembered but never repeated. Because repeating it would kill us all by forcing transformations none of us would choose if we understood what they required. Better to learn from ancient Egypt than live it. Better to study it than survive it. Better to remember it than become it. And better to answer honestly when asked if we'd survive there. No, never. Not possible. Not happening. Not without dying in the attempt. No. When we began this exploration, the question seemed straightforward. Would you survive ancient Egypt? Now, thousands of words later, we understand it was never straightforward at all. It was question with layers. Physical survival, psychological survival, identity survival. Each layer had its own answer, and all the answers converged on the same conclusion. No, you wouldn't survive. Not in any sense that matters, not in any way that preserves who you are. But that negative answer teaches positive lesson about human nature, history, and progress. We are not timeless essences that exist independently of circumstances. We are thoroughly contextualized beings whose possibilities are constrained and enabled by environments we inhabit. Understanding this helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how contingent our current situation remains. Ancient Egypt wasn't moral failure or developmental error. It was solution to survival problems using available resources and knowledge. That solution worked for 3,000 years, which is remarkable success by any measure. That it worked. Through systems we now recognize as unjust doesn't negate its functionality within its historical moment. It just means functionality and justice are separate metrics that don't always align. Modern world is solving different survival problems with different resources and knowledge. Our solutions work better by metrics of health, longevity, and personal freedom. They work worse by metrics of community cohesion, identity certainty, and cultural continuity. Neither system is perfect. Both involve trade-offs. Both reflect human attempts to survive and occasionally thrive under different constraints. You were born into modern system. You're adapted to its strengths and dependent on its infrastructure. These adaptations make you capable modern human and incapable ancient human. That's not value judgment. It's descriptive statement about specificity of human adaptation to circumstances. Remove modern circumstances and modern humans don't function. Place ancient humans in modern circumstances and they don't function until they adapt. Functioning requires congruence between adaptation and environment. Ancient Egypt represents environments so incongruent with your adaptations that no amount of willpower or determination could bridge the gap. You'd need complete restructuring of capabilities, expectations, and identity. That restructuring would take years if it happened at all, and it would succeed only by destroying everything that makes you recognizably modern. The person who successfully adapted wouldn't be you anymore. They'd be ancient Egyptians shaped by ancient circumstances, and that Egyptian would exist only because you died to enable their emergence. This death wouldn't be visible the way physical death is visible. No moment of cessation, no clear before and after, just gradual dissolution of modern consciousness and gradual emergence of ancient consciousness inhabiting same body. Process would be slow enough that you might not notice until it was complete. Then you'd look back and barely recognize who you'd been. The distance between former self and current self would be so vast that psychological continuity would be questionable at best. That distance is what separates us from ancient Egyptians despite shared biology. We're all humans, but we're very different kinds of humans shaped by very different circumstances. The differences are so profound that crossing between our worlds would be fatal to identity, even if it weren't fatal to body. Ancient Egypt forces us to confront this truth about human existence. We are what we are because of when and where we are. Change when or where significantly enough, and we become something else. That something else might survive, but we don't. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. That's certain. But understanding why you wouldn't survive teaches more valuable lesson than successful survival ever could. It teaches humility about our place in history, gratitude for our circumstances, and recognition that human experience is far more varied than modern perspective usually acknowledges. We are fortunate to live when we do, not superior to those who lived when they did. Fortune is luck. Superiority would be achievement. We achieved nothing by being born in modern era. We simply got lucky. That luck is worth preserving and extending. Not because modern world is perfect, but because it enables possibilities ancient world couldn't enable. Health, education, opportunity, freedom. These aren't just material benefits. They're preconditions for human flourishing that ancient people rarely experienced and couldn't reliably provide. That we can provide them, even incompletely, represents genuine progress. Not evolution of human nature, evolution of human circumstances. And that evolution matters more than we usually acknowledge. Ancient Egypt reminds us that human circumstances can be harsh, that survival can be struggle, that life can be short and difficult and constrained. It also reminds us that humans can endure remarkably difficult circumstances and still create beauty, meaning, and civilization worth remembering. Both lessons matter. Both should inform how we think about past and present and future. You wouldn't survive ancient Egypt. Be glad you don't have to. Be grateful for circumstances that make survival easier than it was for most humans across most of history. Be mindful that those circumstances could change. Be intentional about preserving and extending them to everyone, because what happened to you in ancient Egypt could happen to anyone in any era, lacking infrastructure, knowledge, and social organization that make modern survival possible. That's final lesson. Ancient Egypt isn't just historical curiosity. It's reminder of what human life looks like without modern advantages. It's cautionary tale about what we could lose if we're not careful. It's testament to human resilience, but also human vulnerability. It's everything that modern world isn't, and everything modern world was built to escape. And it's reason to answer honestly when asked whether we'd survive there. No, we wouldn't. Not then. Not there. Not without dying or transforming beyond recognition. And that honest answer is simultaneously humbling acknowledgement of our dependence on modern circumstances and grateful recognition that we're fortunate enough to depend on them. Ancient Egypt was real. Ancient Egyptians endured it. We don't have to. That difference matters more than any other fact about ancient Egypt we could possibly learn. It's the difference between examining history and experiencing it, between understanding past and living it, between observing ancient struggle and enduring it ourselves. We observe, they endured, and the distance between observation and endurance is measured in 3,000 years of historical development that transformed human circumstances fundamentally. That transformation is why you wouldn't survive ancient Egypt, not because you're incapable, because you're different, so different that ancient world would be incompatible with your existence, and that incompatibility is both tragedy and triumph. Tragedy that humans once lived that way, triumph that we no longer must, both true, both important, both worth remembering as we ask and answer whether we'd survive ancient Egypt. No, we wouldn't, and that's exactly as it should be.